The stagecoach door swung open, and Eleanor Price couldn't breathe. Below her stood the man who'd promised her a future in careful, measured letters. Graham Holt, the Colorado rancher who was supposed to become her husband. But terror seized her limbs. Every other passenger had descended. The driver cleared his throat impatiently. The crowd whispered. Still, she sat frozen, knuckles white against her carpet bag. Then Graham stepped forward, removing his weathered hat, and extended his calloused hand toward her trembling form. "The first step's always the hardest, Miss Price," he said quietly, "but I promise you won't take it alone." Welcome to our story. Stay with us until the very end to see how this mail-order bride's terrifying first moment transforms into something extraordinary, and please comment with your city name so we can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The morning Eleanor Price left Boston, the city wore its customary gray like a widow's veil. Rain slicked the cobblestones of Beacon Hill, turning the familiar streets into rivers of black that reflected nothing but her own distorted shadow. She stood on the platform of the railway station with a single carpetbag clutching everything she owned: 3 dresses, her mother's silver brush, a Bible with pressed flowers between the pages, and 16 letters tied with string. 16 careful, thoughtful letters from a man named Graham Holt, a rancher in Willow Ridge, Colorado, who needed a wife. Eleanor was 23 years old, educated beyond what most considered practical for a woman, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Her father had died 8 months earlier, leaving nothing but gambling debts that consumed their modest home like rot through wood. The relatives who might have taken her in had already made clear she'd be a burden. The respectable positions available to unmarried women, governess, seamstress, companion to elderly ladies, had all closed their doors. Too educated for service, too poor for society, too proud to beg, Eleanor had faced a future that narrowed to a single point of darkness, until she'd answered the advertisement in the Boston Gazette. Rancher in Colorado Territory seeks correspondence with respectable woman of good character for matrimonial purposes. Must be willing to embrace frontier life. Respond to G. Holt, Willow Ridge. She'd written that first letter with shaking hands, convinced nothing would come of it. But Graham Holt had replied within 3 weeks, his penmanship surprisingly elegant for a man who made his living from cattle and land. He wrote about the mountains, about the brutal winters and startling springs, about building something lasting in a place where everything felt temporary. He didn't make false promises or paint the West as paradise. He was honest about the hardship, the isolation, the work that never ended, and somehow that honesty had made her trust him. Now, as the train's whistle shrieked through the Boston morning, Eleanor climbed aboard with the terrible certainty that she was either saving her life or ending it. The journey west took 5 days by rail, then another 2 by stagecoach from Denver into the mountains. Eleanor watched the landscape transform outside the dusty windows, from the crowded eastern cities to endless prairies, from flat grasslands to rolling hills, and finally to the dramatic rise of the Rocky Mountains, their peaks still crowned with snow even in late May. Inside the stagecoach for the final leg, she shared space with a cattle buyer who smelled of cigars, a minister's wife traveling to join her husband, and a young prospector with wild eyes who kept muttering about silver veins. They'd been rattling along rough mountain roads for hours, the coach swaying dangerously on turns that sent Eleanor's stomach into her throat. "First time in Colorado?" the minister's wife asked kindly. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she had a round, motherly face that invited confidences. "Yes," Eleanor managed, gripping the leather strap as they jolted over another rut. "Visiting family?" Eleanor hesitated. I'm to be married." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! Is your young man meeting you in Willow Ridge?" "He is." Eleanor's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Though I've never actually... We've only corresponded by letter." The older woman's expression shifted from delight to concern. "A mail-order arrangement?" The term made Eleanor flinch, though it was accurate. "Yes." Mrs. Patterson reached across the bouncing space between them and patted Eleanor's hand. "Well, dear, I won't judge. Many good marriages have started that way out here. The frontier's short on women and long on lonely men. What's his name?" "Graham Holt. He owns a ranch outside town." "Holt?" The cattle buyer perked up, his cigar waggling as he spoke. "I know Graham Holt, good man, fair dealer. Lost his parents about 5 years back, his mother to pneumonia, his father the following winter. Been running that ranch alone since then, built it up to something impressive. You could do worse, miss." The information should have comforted her, but Eleanor felt her chest tighten instead. A good man, a respected man. A man who would take one look at her stepping off the stagecoach, pale, travel-worn, clearly running from something, and realize he'd made a terrible mistake. "What if—" she began, then stopped. "What if what, dear?" Mrs. Patterson prompted gently. "What if I'm not what he expected?" The minister's wife smiled sadly. "And what if he's not what you expected? That's the gamble you're both taking. But I'll tell you this, any man who takes the time to write thoughtful letters for months, rather than just sending for the first woman willing to come, is a man who cares about finding the right match. Try to have faith." Faith. Eleanor turned the word over in her mind like a smooth stone. She'd had faith once, in her father's promises that he'd stop gambling, in society's assurances that respectability mattered, in the idea that good behavior would be rewarded. All of it had proven false. Faith seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford, but she'd come too far to turn back now. The stagecoach rounded a final bend, and suddenly Willow Ridge spread before them, a collection of wooden buildings clustered in a valley, with the mountains rising dramatically behind. It was smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 30 buildings in total, but there was something solid about it. Unlike the ramshackle mining camps they'd passed, Willow Ridge looked built to last. 10 minutes to town," the driver called from above. 10 minutes. Eleanor's heart began to pound. She fumbled for her reticule, pulled out a small mirror, tried to tidy her hair. 5 days on trains and 2 in a stagecoach had left her disheveled, despite her best efforts. Her dark brown hair had escaped its pins, her traveling dress was creased and dusty, and her face looked drawn and pale. "I look like a refugee," she thought desperately. "Not a bride." "You look fine, dear," Mrs. Patterson assured her, though her eyes were kind rather than truthful. The stagecoach rolled down the main street, really the only proper street, past a mercantile, a saloon, a building marked Land Office, another labeled Dr. Marcus Webb, Physician, and a small white church. People stopped to watch their arrival. A few children ran alongside the coach, whooping with excitement, and then Eleanor saw him. He stood outside the building marked Willow Ridge Station, taller than she'd imagined, with broad shoulders under a canvas jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even from a distance, even through the dust-hazed window, she could sense his solidity, the way he stood planted like one of the pine trees on the mountainside, unmoving despite the bustle around him. Graham Holt, the man who was supposed to become her husband, the man who was supposed to save her, the man who would see right through her desperation. "Here we are," the driver announced cheerfully, pulling the horses to a halt with a final jolt that nearly sent Eleanor sprawling. The cattle buyer was first out, then the prospector, who practically leaped from the coach in his eagerness. Mrs. Patterson descended with dignified care, helped by the driver. Then the driver turned to Eleanor. "Miss Price, this is your stop?" But Eleanor couldn't move. Through the open door, she could see him more clearly now. Graham had removed his hat, revealing dark hair slightly long at the collar. His face was sun-weathered, strong-featured, older than she'd imagined, perhaps 35. He was scanning the coach, clearly looking for her. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world contracted to just that connection. His eyes were gray-blue, like the sky before a storm, and they held an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise? Disappointment? She couldn't tell, and the not knowing paralyzed her. "Miss Price?" the driver repeated, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. "I've got mail to deliver and a schedule to keep." The minister's wife had already disembarked and was greeting her husband, a thin man in a black coat. The cattle buyer was deep in conversation with a local rancher. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the stagecoach's arrival was starting to whisper. But Eleanor sat frozen, her hands locked around her carpet bag, her entire body rigid with terror. "I can't do this," she thought wildly. "I'll tell him there's been a mistake. I'll stay at a boarding house. I'll find work. I'll go back to Denver. Graham stepped forward. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, crossing the dusty street with long, measured strides. When he reached the coach, he looked up at her, and his expression softened into something that might have been understanding. "Miss Price." His voice was deep, roughened by weather and work, but gentle. "I'm Graham Holt." She managed a nod, her throat too tight for words. He glanced at the crowd, then back at her. "It's a hard thing, stepping into something unknown. I expect you're tired from the journey, too. Must have been rough coming over the pass with the spring thaw making the roads uncertain." It was such a practical observation, so matter-of-fact, that Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She began, then stopped. What could she say? "I'm terrified? I'm having second thoughts? I think I've made a terrible mistake?" Graham seemed to sense her turmoil. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands, then back up at her. "The first step's always the hardest," he said quietly, extending his hand toward her. "But I promise you won't take it alone." His hand was broad, calloused from years of hard work, the nails clean but worn. It was a working man's hand, honest and strong. And steady, perfectly steady, no tremor of impatience or frustration despite her foolish hesitation. Eleanor looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment. Behind Graham, she could see the minister's wife watching with encouraging eyes. Further back, shopkeepers and townspeople were beginning to drift away, losing interest in the drama. The driver shifted his weight, clearly wanting to be on his way. She thought about Boston, about the empty house seized by creditors, about the aunt who'd refused to see her, about the long, dark winter ahead if she turned back now. She thought about Graham's letters, careful and honest, promising nothing but a chance. Slowly, Eleanor shifted her carpetbag to her left hand. She smoothed her skirt with her right, buying another moment. Then, taking a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deep in the earth, she reached out. When her gloved hand touched his, she felt the warmth of him even through the fabric. His fingers closed around hers, firm but not crushing, supportive but not possessive. He held her gaze as he helped her navigate the high step down from the coach, his other hand coming to steady her elbow. Her boots touched Colorado soil for the first time. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. From relief or terror, she couldn't say. But Graham's grip tightened just enough to keep her upright. "There," he said softly, a hint of approval in his voice. "The hardest part's done." Up close, he was even more imposing, a good foot taller than her own 5 feet 4 inches, with the kind of solid build that came from real work rather than gymnastics in a city club. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lines etched around his eyes and mouth, but there was something fundamentally decent in his expression. No cruelty, no calculation, just a straightforward steadiness that made her feel, for the first time in months, that perhaps the ground beneath her feet wouldn't give way. Thank you," she managed. Graham released her hand but stayed close, creating a small barrier between her and the curious eyes of the town. "You'll be wanting to rest, I expect. Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable boarding house just down the street. I've taken the liberty of arranging a room for you there." Eleanor blinked. "A boarding house? But I thought that we'd be married straight away?" Graham's expression remained calm. "We will be, if that's still what you want after you've had time to catch your breath. But you've just crossed half the continent, Miss Price. Seemed to me you might appreciate a bed that doesn't move, a decent meal, and a night's sleep before making any final decisions." The unexpected consideration nearly undid her. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "That's very thoughtful. Just practical," Graham said, though his eyes warmed slightly. "Mrs. Holloway's expecting you. I'll have your trunk sent over soon as they unload it. Will you let me walk you there, or would you prefer to go on your own?" The question surprised her. He was giving her a choice, acknowledging her agency even in this small thing. "I'd appreciate the escort," she said quietly. "I don't know the town." "It's not much of a town," Graham admitted with a slight smile. "More of an ambitious village, but the people are mostly decent, and it's growing steady. This way." He offered his arm. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his jacket. They walked slowly up the main street, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes following them, curious, assessing, judging. "They're wondering about me," she said, keeping her voice low. They're wondering about us both, Graham corrected. Small town. News travels faster than wildfire. By sundown, everyone within 10 miles will know Graham Holt's mail-order bride finally arrived. He glanced down at her. Does that bother you, the talk? I suppose I'll have to get used to it. You don't have to do anything, Graham said firmly. That's something you should know right off. You're not obligated to me, Miss Price. The money I sent for your train fare, that was given freely, no strings. If you decide this isn't what you want, I won't hold you to anything. You can stay at Mrs. Holloway's as long as you need to figure out your next step. Eleanor's step faltered. You do that? Let me just leave? Graham stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I asked for a wife, Miss Price, not an indentured servant. I want a partner, someone who chooses to be here. A marriage built on obligation won't last a hard winter, and we get hard winters. His gray blue eyes held hers steadily. So, yes, if you decide to leave, I'll help you do it. The sincerity in his voice was almost painful. Eleanor had to look away, blinking hard. I don't have anywhere else to go, she admitted, the words scraped raw. That's honest, Graham said quietly. I appreciate that. But need isn't the same as obligation. Right now you need a place to rest and think clearly. Come on, Mrs. Holloway makes the best coffee in 3 counties, and she's been looking forward to meeting you. They continued up the street. Graham pointed out the key buildings as they passed. The mercantile owned by Samuel Garrett and his wife, the saloon that was rowdy but rarely dangerous, the doctor's office, the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. Do you have a church? Eleanor asked, noticing the white building they'd passed earlier. We do. Reverend Davis holds services every Sunday, performs marriages, baptisms, the occasional funeral. He's a good man, educated back east. You'll like him. The boarding house was a 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, a porch wrapped around the front, and flower boxes already bright with early summer blooms. It looked well-maintained and welcoming. Graham opened the gate in the white picket fence, and they walked up the path to the front door. Before he could knock, it swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, intelligent dark eyes, and a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw Eleanor. You must be Miss Price, she said warmly. I'm Judith Holloway. Come in, come in. You look exhausted, poor dear. Graham, bring her bag inside and then leave us be. The girl needs peace, not a man hovering about. Yes, ma'am, Graham said with evident amusement. He carried Eleanor's carpetbag inside, set it down in the neat hallway, then turned back to Eleanor. I'll come by tomorrow morning if that's all right with you. Around 9? We can talk then, figure out what happens next. Tomorrow, Eleanor agreed, feeling suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Graham nodded, put his hat back on, and tipped it to both women. Mrs. Holloway. Miss Price. Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the porch, fading as he walked away. Well, Mrs. Holloway said briskly, shutting the door. Let's get you settled. You'll want a bath first, I expect. I've got water heating already. Then food. You're thin as a rail, child. When did you last eat a proper meal? I'm not sure, Eleanor admitted. The journey had been a blur of bad coffee and worse food at railway stops. Thought as much. Come upstairs. I've put you in the blue room at the front. It's the nicest, and Graham specifically requested it. Mrs. Holloway led the way up a narrow staircase, talking as she climbed. He's been fussing over your arrival like a mother hen for weeks. Came by 3 times to make sure the room would be comfortable. Brought fresh linens himself. Even bought new curtains, can you imagine? A rancher, buying curtains. She pushed open a door to reveal a cheerful room with blue and white wallpaper, a large bed covered in a wedding ring quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a comfortable chair by the window, and yes, new curtains, white lace that filtered the afternoon light into patterns on the wooden floor. It's lovely, Eleanor said, her throat tight. Graham Holt's a good man, Mrs. Holloway said, setting Eleanor's bag on the bed. Lost both parents within a year of each other, poor soul, and he's been running that ranch alone since then. Doesn't come to town much except for supplies and business. Keeps to himself, mostly, but he's fair, honest, and works harder than any 3 men combined. When word got around that he'd sent for a mail-order bride, I'll admit there was plenty of talk. She fixed Eleanor with a sharp look. But I've known Graham since he was a boy. If he chose you out of all the women who might have responded to that advertisement, he had good reason. He's not a fool and he's not impulsive. The words should have been comforting, but they only increased the weight on Eleanor's shoulders. I hope I don't disappoint him. Oh, honey, Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. You're scared. Of course you are. But let me tell you something. He's scared too. A man doesn't live alone for 5 years and then suddenly bring home a wife without considerable nerves. You're both taking a risk. She patted Eleanor's arm. Now, I'll fetch that bath. You soak and think, and then we'll get some food into you. Things always look better after a bath and a meal. She bustled out, leaving Eleanor alone in the blue room. Slowly, Eleanor unpinned her hat and set it on the dresser. She caught sight of herself in the mirror, pale, drawn, her hair a disaster, her eyes too large in her thin face. She looked haunted. No wonder Graham had sent her to a boarding house rather than taking her directly to the ranch. He'd taken one look at her and realized his mistake. But he hadn't seemed disappointed. If anything, he'd seemed careful, considerate, as if she were something fragile that might break with rough handling. Eleanor sank onto the bed, the quilt soft beneath her. She could hear Mrs. Holloway moving around downstairs, the sound of water being poured. Outside the window, Willow Ridge was going about its afternoon business, a wagon creaking past, children's laughter, someone hammering in the distance. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Crossed the country, stepped off that stagecoach, taken Graham Holt's hand. Now came the harder part, deciding if she could really go through with the rest. True to her word, Mrs. Holloway soon returned with a copper tub and bucket after bucket of hot water. Eleanor bathed gratefully, scrubbing away layers of travel grime, washing her hair with the lavender-scented soap provided. When she emerged, wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown, she found a tray waiting in her room, thick stew, fresh bread, butter, and what had to be the best coffee she'd ever tasted. She ate ravenously, surprised by her hunger. When had food last tasted this good? Not in Boston, where every meal had been shadowed by worry and grief. Clean, fed, and utterly exhausted, Eleanor crawled into bed as the sun was setting. Through the lace curtains, she could see the mountains turning purple in the dusk, their peaks touched with gold. Somewhere out there was Graham's ranch. Tomorrow, she'd have to face him again, have to make decisions about her future. But tonight, in this comfortable room that smelled of lavender and fresh air, Eleanor let herself simply rest. She woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through those lace curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she was disoriented, not recognizing the room. Then memory flooded back, and with it, a flutter of anxiety. Today. She'd see Graham today. Eleanor rose and dressed carefully in her best day dress, green cotton with black trim, not fancy, but respectable. She arranged her hair with more care than she'd been able to manage yesterday, pinning it up in a style her mother had taught her years ago, a touch of rosewater, her mother's cameo at her throat. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone who looked, if not confident, at least composed. It would have to do. Downstairs, Mrs. Holloway was serving breakfast to several other boarders, a couple of miners, a traveling salesman, and a schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy, who was new to Willow Ridge herself. Eleanor received curious looks, but Mrs. Holloway's firm presence kept anyone from being too forward with questions. "Eat," Mrs. Holloway commanded, setting a plate in front of Eleanor. "Graham will be here soon, and you need your strength." "Is he—" Eleanor hesitated. "What should I expect?" "Expect him to be straightforward," Mrs. Holloway said. "Graham's not one for pretty speeches or wasted words. He'll say what he means and mean what he says. Beyond that, you'll have to judge for yourself." At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat. Mrs. Holloway answered and returned with Graham following, his hat in his hands. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, fresh shirt, vest, clean-shaven, but there was tension in the set of his shoulders. "Miss Price," he said, nodding to her. "Morning. I hope you slept well." "I did. Thank you. The room is lovely." "Good. That's good." He shifted his weight, then seemed to gather himself. "I thought we might have breakfast and talk. There's a cafe down the street, quiet this time of morning, if that's acceptable to you." "I've already eaten, but I'd be happy to join you for coffee." Mrs. Holloway shooed them out, and soon Eleanor found herself walking down the main street of Willow Ridge in the bright morning light. The town looked different in daylight, less intimidating, almost charming. People called out greetings to Graham as they passed, and he responded with nods and brief words, but he didn't stop to introduce Eleanor. She appreciated that. Time enough for scrutiny later. The cafe was a simple establishment called Rosie's, run by a formidable woman with flower in her hair and a warm smile. She took one look at Graham and Eleanor and seated them at a corner table, away from the few other early customers. "Coffee for both?" she asked. "Please," Graham said, "and I'll have the usual breakfast." When Rosie left, Graham turned his attention to Eleanor. In the clear morning light, she could see him better, the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, the slight crook in his nose suggesting it had been broken once, the overall impression of a man who'd lived hard but honestly. "Miss Price," he began, then paused. "That's awkward. May I call you Eleanor? And you should call me Graham. If we're going to... well, seems foolish to stand on formality." "Eleanor is fine," she said quietly. "Eleanor." He tested the name, nodded. "I'll get right to it. I know yesterday was overwhelming. I should have realized you'd need time to collect yourself before anything else. That was my mistake." "It wasn't a mistake, Qasim," Eleanor said quickly. "You were very kind. I was just scared," Graham finished. "I understand. This is a big step, coming out here to marry a stranger. I don't take that lightly." He leaned forward slightly, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "So here's what I propose. You stay at Mrs. Holloway's for a bit. A week, maybe 2. We spend time together, talking, getting to know each other beyond letters. I'll show you the ranch, introduce you around town. You can decide if this is really what you want." Eleanor blinked. "You'd wait? Even though I'm already here?" "Especially because you're already here," Graham said firmly. "Eleanor, I don't want a wife who feels trapped. I want..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I've been alone 5 years. That's a long time. I'm not looking for just anyone to fill space in my house and warm my bed. I'm looking for a partner, someone who wants to build something with me, who chooses this life. That requires respect on both sides, and you can't have respect without choice." Rosie arrived with Graham's breakfast, eggs, bacon, potatoes, biscuits, and refilled their coffee. When she left, Graham continued. "I know you came here out of necessity," he said quietly. "You said as much in your letters, though you tried to frame it more delicately. Your father passed, left you in difficult straits. You had no family willing or able to take you in, few prospects in Boston. I understand that. Half the people in this territory are here because something pushed them west: debt, scandal, ambition, heartbreak. That doesn't make you less worthy of choosing your own path forward." The unexpected understanding made Eleanor's eyes sting. "What if I'm not what you need? You asked for someone willing to embrace frontier life, but I'm a city girl. I don't know anything about ranching, about this kind of life." "You can learn," Graham said simply. "And I can teach. What you can't learn is character, and I saw that in your letters. You write with honesty and intelligence. You asked real questions about the hardships, not just the romance of the West. You didn't shy away when I told you about the isolation, the work, the harsh winters." He took a bite of his eggs, chewed thoughtfully. "Besides, my mother was from Philadelphia, married my father, and came west when this whole territory was even rougher than it is now. She adapted, became one of the strongest women I've ever known." "You mentioned her in your letters," Eleanor said. "You said she loved wildflowers." Something flickered in Graham's expression, grief, briefly visible before he controlled it. "She did. Planted them everywhere around the ranch house. Said even in the wilderness, people needed beauty. After she died, I let them go wild. Couldn't bring myself to tend them properly. But before you arrived, I cleaned up the beds, planted new ones. Thought she'd have liked that. Meeting you, I mean." The image of this solid, practical man tending flowers in memory of his mother and in anticipation of a bride touched something deep in Eleanor's chest. "I'd like to see them," she said softly. "Then I'll take you out to the ranch. Today, if you're willing. Not to stay," he added quickly. Just to see it, to understand what you'd be stepping into. Eleanor nodded slowly. All right. They finished their coffee, and Graham paid Rosie, waving off Eleanor's protest. My invitation, my expense, he said firmly. Outside, he led her to where he'd left his wagon, a sturdy affair with a bench seat and a team of 2 strong horses. This is Bess and Buck, he said, patting the nearest horse. They're steady, won't spook easily. Important out here. He helped Eleanor up to the seat, his hands careful at her waist, then climbed up beside her. With a click of his tongue and a light touch of the reins, they rolled out of town. The road, really more of a wide track, wound through the valley and then up into the foothills. As they climbed, the views opened up spectacularly. Behind them, Willow Ridge became a toy town. Ahead, the mountains rose in wave after wave of purple and blue, their peaks still white with snow. It's beautiful, Eleanor breathed. It is, Graham agreed. Though beauty doesn't keep you warm in January or put food on the table. The land gives, but it takes too. That's something you need to understand. This isn't easy living. Did you grow up here? On this ranch, yes. My parents homesteaded it 28 years ago before I was born. Built everything from scratch, the house, the barns, the fences. They raised cattle, some horses. Did well enough to expand the herd over the years. When they died, it all fell to me. He was quiet for a moment. There are days it feels like too much for one person. That's part of why He trailed off. Why you sent for a wife, Eleanor finished. Yes. Though it's not just about needing help, it's about... Graham struggled for words. I'm 34 years old. I've spent 5 years talking to cattle and horses more than people. That's not a life. I want what my parents had, a partnership. Someone to share the burden and the joy of this place. They crested a rise, and suddenly Eleanor could see it. A valley nestled between hills, a stream glinting silver in the sunlight, and at the center, a house. It was larger than she'd expected, built of logs but well crafted, with a steep roof, a wide porch, and stone chimneys at each end. Around it were several outbuildings, barns, a chicken coop, what looked like a smokehouse. And everywhere, spilling from beds near the house, growing wild along the fence lines, were flowers, pinks and purples and yellows, riotous and joyful. His mother's flowers. Oh, Eleanor said softly. Graham pulled the wagon to a stop, letting her look. The house has 4 rooms downstairs. Main room with the kitchen, my parents' old bedroom which I use now, a spare room, and a storage room. Upstairs is a loft I used as a boy, mostly storage now. There's a root cellar, smokehouse for curing meat, barn for the horses and equipment, cattle barn further out. We've got about 200 head of cattle ranging over several hundred acres, plus a dozen horses. He pointed to different features as he spoke, his voice taking on a note of quiet pride. That's the vegetable garden there, needs work. The orchard beyond, apples and some plums, my mother planted them. The stream provides water year-round, never runs dry even in drought. There's good grazing in the valley and up in the higher meadows in summer. It's wonderful, Eleanor said, and meant it. There was something solid about the place, something that spoke of generations of work and care. Do you manage it all alone? Mostly. I hire 2 hands for spring roundup and branding, sometimes help during haying season. But day to day, it's just me. He glanced at her. It's a lot of work, Eleanor. I won't lie about that. A rancher's wife has to be ready to pitch in, tending chickens, gardening, sometimes helping with cattle work. It's not a life of leisure. I never expected leisure, Eleanor said quietly. I expected work. I just don't know how to do this particular work yet. Yet, Graham repeated, catching the word. That's the right attitude. He snapped the reins gently, and they rolled down into the valley. As they approached the house, several dogs came running out, barking excitedly. That's Chester, the big one's Duke, and the little troublemaker is Buttons, Graham said with obvious affection. They're working dogs mostly, help with the cattle, but they're friendly. The dogs swarmed the wagon, tails wagging furiously. When Graham helped Eleanor down, they immediately investigated her, sniffing and nudging for attention. Despite her nervousness, Eleanor found herself smiling, reaching down to pet them. They like you, Graham observed. That's a good sign. He led her up to the house. The porch was swept clean, with two rocking chairs positioned to look out over the valley. Graham opened the door, and Eleanor stepped inside. The main room was spacious, dominated by a large stone fireplace, with the kitchen area at one end, a wood stove, shelves of dishes and pots, a sturdy table with chairs. The furniture was handmade but quality, everything neat and carefully maintained. Braided rugs covered the wooden floors. Windows let in streams of light. And everywhere were small touches that spoke of recent care. Fresh curtains in the windows, new cushions on the chairs, flowers in a vase on the table, books neatly arranged on a shelf. "You've been preparing," Eleanor said, unable to hide her surprise. Graham looked almost embarrassed. Seemed right to make the place presentable. It had gotten a bit rough. Living alone, you stop noticing certain things. He showed her through the rooms, the spare bedroom that could be hers if she wanted privacy, the storage room, the loft upstairs reached by a sturdy ladder. When they returned to the main room, Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the flower-filled yard, the valley beyond, the mountains in the distance. It was so different from Boston, vast where Boston was cramped, wild where Boston was controlled, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human decoration. "What do you think?" Graham asked quietly, standing a respectful distance behind her. Eleanor turned to face him. In the light streaming through the windows, she could see him clearly, this man who'd written her thoughtful letters for months, who'd tended flowers for a mother 5 years gone, who'd offered her a choice when he could have demanded obligation. "I think," she said slowly, "that this is the most honest place I've ever seen. No pretense, no false fronts, just what it is. Is that good or bad?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "It's overwhelming. Beautiful, but overwhelming." Graham nodded. "That's honest too. I appreciate that." He gestured to the chairs by the window. "Sit with me a moment." They sat, and for a while neither spoke. Outside, the dogs were chasing each other across the yard. A hawk wheeled overhead, riding the thermals. The stream chuckled over its stones. "Eleanor," Graham finally said, "I want you to know something. Whatever you decide, I won't think less of you. If you choose to go back east or to stay in Willow Ridge but not marry me or to try this for a month and then leave, I understand. This is a hard life, and you don't owe me anything. You paid for my train fare. You've been preparing this house. I did those things freely," he interrupted gently. "Not as a debt you need to repay. I asked you to come here. That was my choice. What happens next is yours." The generosity of it, the fundamental decency, made Eleanor's throat tight. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you being so kind?" Graham considered the question seriously. "My father used to say that how you treat people when you have power over them shows your true character. Right now, you're in a vulnerable position. New place, no resources, dependent on my goodwill. I could use that. Some men would. But that would make me a bully, not a husband." He met her eyes steadily. "I want a partner, Eleanor. Partners respect each other. If we're going to build something together, it has to start with that respect." Eleanor looked at this man, this unexpected, honorable man, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of trust, fragile as new growth. "2 weeks," she said. "Let's take the 2 weeks you mentioned. Get to know each other properly, and then I'll give you my answer." Graham's face relaxed into the first real smile she'd seen from him. 2 weeks sounds good. We'll do this right." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Eleanor took it, and this time, when his calloused palm closed around her fingers, she didn't feel only terror. She felt possibility. As they prepared to return to town, Eleanor paused at the door, looking back at the house, at the careful preparations, the flowers, the home that could be hers. "Graham?" she said. He turned. "Yes?" "Thank you for giving me a choice." His expression softened. "Everyone deserves that much, Eleanor. Everyone." On the ride back to Willow Ridge, they talked more easily, about Boston and what she'd left behind, about the ranch and its rhythms, about the small things that make up a life. And for the first time since that terrible day she'd learned about her father's debts, Eleanor felt something like hope. The 2 weeks had begun. The outcome was uncertain, but at least finally she was choosing her own path, one step at a time. The days that followed took on a rhythm Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Each morning, Graham would arrive at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house precisely at 9, hat in hand, with some plan for how they might spend their time together. He approached courtship with the same methodical care he clearly brought to ranching, thoughtful, deliberate, never rushing. On the second day, he took her to meet Reverend Davis, a scholarly man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. They sat in the small parsonage behind the church, drinking tea while the Reverend asked Eleanor about her background, her faith, her understanding of what marriage in this territory would require. "It's not like Boston," Reverend Davis said gently, stirring honey into his tea. "Out here, a marriage needs to be a true partnership. The work is too hard, the conditions too demanding for anything less. You'll need to depend on each other in ways city folk rarely understand." "I'm beginning to see that," Eleanor replied, glancing at Graham, who sat quietly, letting her speak for herself. "Graham's a good man," the Reverend continued, "known him since he was a boy. His parents were pillars of this community, and he's carried on their legacy with integrity. But he's also been alone a long time. That changes a person, makes them set in their ways. You'll both need to be patient with each other as you learn to share a life." After they left the parsonage, Eleanor turned to Graham as they walked back toward the main street. "He seems fond of you." "Reverend Davis performed my parents' funeral services," Graham said quietly. "Sat with me through some hard nights after. He's seen me at my worst, which makes his good opinion worth something." He paused, then added, "He liked you. I could tell." "How could you tell?" "He used his best tea service. He only does that for people he respects." The observation, so particular and genuine, made Eleanor smile. "I'm glad I passed the tea service test." "It's not a test," Graham said, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Just people watching out for each other. That's how it works here." On the third day, Graham took her to the mercantile to meet Samuel and Martha Garrett, the couple who ran the store that was the commercial heart of Willow Ridge. Martha was a plump, cheerful woman who immediately swept Eleanor into a discussion of fabrics and household goods, while Samuel, tall and quiet, talked business with Graham. "We get shipments from Denver every 2 weeks, Martha explained, showing Eleanor bolts of fabric. "It's not Boston selection, mind you, but we stock the essentials. And Samuel can order special items if you give him enough notice. Took 3 months to get Graham's bathtub here last year." She winked. "Caused quite a stir, that did. Everyone knew it meant he was getting serious about bringing home a bride." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. He mentioned the bathtub in one of his letters. Did he mention how he personally hauled it out to the ranch in his wagon, recruited 4 men to help install it, and spent a week making sure the plumbing worked properly? Martha laughed. "That man's nothing if not thorough. When Graham Holt decides to do something, he does it right." Later, as they left the mercantile with a small package of lace Martha had insisted Eleanor needed, "Every woman needs something pretty, dear." Eleanor said, "Everyone here seems to know all your business." "That's the price of small-town living," Graham acknowledged. "Privacy's hard to come by. Does it bother you?" Eleanor considered. In Boston, she'd valued privacy, the anonymity of city life. But Boston's privacy had also meant isolation when she'd needed help, closed doors when she'd needed support. "I suppose it depends on whether people are watching out of kindness or judgment." "Mostly kindness here," Graham said. "Though there's always some judgment mixed in. People are people, wherever you go." He shifted the package under his arm. "But I'll tell you this. When my mother got sick, folks came from all over to help. Brought food, sat with her, prayed with her. When she died, and then my father 6 months later, I had more help than I knew what to do with. That's the other side of everyone knowing your business. When trouble comes, you're not alone." The words settled something in Eleanor. She'd been alone for so long, carrying her burdens in silence because there was no one to share them with. The idea of a community that actually cared, that showed up in times of trouble, felt almost foreign. On the 4th day it rained, a spring storm that rolled in from the mountains with dramatic speed, turning the sky dark and unleashing sheets of water on the town. Graham arrived at Mrs. Holloway's with a sheepish expression and his hat dripping. "Weather had other plans for us," he said. "I was going to show you the higher pastures today, but that'll have to wait." Mrs. Holloway, overhearing, immediately took charge. "You'll both catch your death if you go out in this. Eleanor, dear, why don't you and Graham use the parlor? I'll bring coffee and leave you two to talk. About time you had a proper conversation without the whole town watching anyway." So Eleanor found herself sitting in Mrs. Holloway's comfortable parlor with Graham, rain drumming on the roof, a fire crackling in the hearth to ward off the chill. Mrs. Holloway brought coffee and warm apple cake, then tactfully disappeared. For a moment they sat in awkward silence. Without the distraction of showing her around town or the ranch, without the buffer of other people, they were just two near strangers trying to figure out if they could build a life together. "Tell me about your mother," Eleanor said finally, choosing a topic she knew mattered to him. Graham's expression softened. She was remarkable. Strong, but not in a harsh way. She could deliver a calf, shoot a rattlesnake, and then sit down and play piano like she'd never left Philadelphia. He smiled at the memory. "She made sure I had education, taught me herself since we were too far from any school, mathematics, history, literature. She believed frontier living shouldn't mean frontier thinking." "Is that her piano?" Eleanor gestured to the upright instrument in the corner of the parlor. "No, that's Mrs. Holloway's. Ours is still at the ranch. I don't play, never had the talent for it. But I can't bring myself to sell it. Mother played every evening, said it civilized the wilderness." His voice grew quieter. "The pneumonia took her fast. One week she was fine, the next she was struggling to breathe. Doc Webb did everything he could, but—" "And your father?" "Lost the will to live, I think. He loved her that much. Started making dangerous mistakes, taking foolish risks. Went out in a blizzard to check on cattle when he should have waited for the weather to break. Froze to death less than a mile from the house." Graham stared into the fire. "I found him the next morning. That was the worst day of my life." Eleanor reached across the space between them and touched his hand. "I'm so sorry." Graham looked down at her hand on his, then slowly turned his palm up, letting their fingers intertwine. "Tell me about your father," he said. "You mentioned in your letters that he passed, but not much more." It was Eleanor's turn to stare into the fire. He was a clerk in a shipping office, respectable position, decent income, but he had a weakness for cards and horses. Mother died when I was 15, and after that he got worse, started gambling more, drinking more. I tried to manage the household accounts, tried to keep us afloat, but he'd just take whatever money I'd saved and lose it. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "When he died, I thought at least the worry would end. Then the creditors came, and I learned he'd mortgaged everything, borrowed against everything. I had nothing, less than nothing. That's when you answered my advertisement. I saw it in the newspaper at the boarding house where I'd taken a room, the cheapest place I could find, sharing with 3 other women. I'd been looking for work, but without references, without connections." She shook her head. "Your advertisement was honest. You didn't promise luxury or romance. You just offered a chance. That's all I needed. A chance." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, the rain steady outside. "We've both lost people," Graham said finally. "Both been alone. Maybe that's why this feels right to me. Not because we're desperate, but because we understand what it costs to build something in the aftermath of loss." Eleanor looked at their intertwined hands, her pale, slender fingers against his tanned, calloused ones. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid I won't be good enough at this life. Afraid I'll disappoint you." "I'm afraid too," Graham said, surprising her. "Afraid I've forgotten how to share my life with someone. Afraid I'll be too rough, too set in my ways. Afraid you'll wake up one day and regret coming here." He squeezed her hand gently. "But fear's not a reason to avoid something worth having. It's just part of the territory." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Eleanor's chest. This strong, capable man was as uncertain as she was, as worried about failing. Somehow that made her feel less alone. "What was your favorite thing about your mother?" she asked, wanting to move back to safer emotional ground. Graham's face lit up. "Her laugh. She had this laugh that started quiet and then built until it filled the whole house. Father used to do ridiculous things just to make her laugh like that. Once, he tried to teach the barn cat to fetch like a dog. Spent weeks at it. The cat just looked at him with complete disdain, and Mother laughed until she cried. He smiled at the memory. The house felt empty without that laugh. My mother loved gardening, Eleanor said. We had a tiny yard in Boston, barely enough room for anything, but she grew roses, tended them like they were children. After she died, I tried to keep them going, but they gradually faded. I don't think they wanted to live without her either. There's a rose bush at the ranch, Graham said. Old one, hardy. Been there since my mother planted it 20 years ago. Blooms deep red every summer. He paused, then continued. If you stay, you could tend it. Bring it back to its full glory. Mother would have liked that. The tentative offer, the careful, if you stay, made Eleanor's heart ache. I'd like that, she said softly. They talked through the afternoon as the rain continued, sharing stories about their parents, their childhoods, the strange paths that had led them both to this moment. Graham told her about learning to rope cattle, about the first time he'd fallen off a horse, about a pet raccoon he'd raised as a boy until it eventually returned to the wild. Eleanor told him about her mother teaching her to embroider, about learning to cook in their small Boston kitchen, about the public library where she'd spent hours reading everything she could. You like books, Graham observed. There's not many at the ranch, but we could get more. Garrett can order them from Denver. You'd do that? Eleanor, if you marry me, this becomes your home too. That means making it a place where you can be happy. If books make you happy, we'll get books. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if her happiness was simply a practical consideration like fixing a fence or storing hay for winter. By the time the rain stopped and evening approached, Eleanor felt as if she'd known Graham far longer than just 4 days. The ease between them was growing, the awkwardness fading into something more comfortable. When Graham prepared to leave, shrugging on his still damp jacket, he paused at the door. Thank you for today, he said. For talking with me. He seemed to search for words. For giving this a real chance. Thank you for being patient, Eleanor replied. He smiled, touched the brim of his hat, and stepped out into the clearing evening. Eleanor watched from the window as he walked away, his long stride confident even on the muddy street. Mrs. Holloway appeared at her elbow, 2 cups of tea in hand. That man's halfway in love with you already, she said without preamble, handing Eleanor a cup. We barely know each other. Sometimes the heart knows faster than the head. Mrs. Holloway sipped her tea. Graham's not a man who loves easily or lightly, lost too much to risk his heart casually. But I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching, like you're something precious he's afraid to break. I don't want to be something that breaks, Eleanor said quietly. Then don't be. Be something that bends instead, flexible enough to adapt, strong enough not to snap. The older woman patted her arm. You've got that in you. I can see it. You survived losing your father, losing your home, crossing the country alone. That takes steel, even if it doesn't feel like it. On the 5th day, Graham took Eleanor to meet Dr. Marcus Webb, the town physician. Webb was a man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His office smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Miss Price, he said, shaking her hand with professional courtesy. I'm glad to finally meet you. Graham's told me a bit about you. Nothing too damning, I hope, Eleanor said, attempting lightness. Webb smiled. Only that you're educated, thoughtful, and brave enough to cross the continent for a new start. Those are assets out here. He gestured for them to sit. I wanted to meet you because, as the only doctor within 50 miles, I end up being involved in most life events around here. Births, deaths, illnesses, accidents. If you're going to be a rancher's wife, you should know what kind of medical realities you might face. It was the most practical conversation Eleanor had yet had about frontier life. Webb laid out the reality without sugarcoating, the dangers of childbirth without nearby hospitals, the risks of accidents far from help, the importance of basic medical knowledge for treating injuries and illnesses when the doctor couldn't reach you in time. Can you teach me? Eleanor asked. Basic medical care, I mean. Webb looked pleased. I'd be happy to. A rancher's wife who knows how to set a splint, treat a fever, and recognize when something's serious enough to send for help is worth her weight in gold. He glanced at Graham. Your mother had a good hand with healing, Helped me with several difficult cases over the years. I remember, Graham said quietly. She always kept a medicine cabinet stocked. Still do, I hope. Haven't touched it since she died. Didn't know what half of it was for. Webb pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. Then here's what we'll do. Miss Price, if you decide to stay, come see me. I'll teach you what your mother-in-law knew, and then some. We'll go through that medicine cabinet together, restock what's expired, add what's missing. Every ranch should have a proper medical kit. The casual, when you decide to stay, rather than if, made Eleanor's stomach flutter. But Webb's practical approach to the topic was oddly comforting. He wasn't treating her impending marriage as a romantic fairy tale, but as a serious undertaking that required preparation. On the 6th day, Graham brought a wagon to the boarding house with different horses than usual, a matched pair of gentle mares. These are Daisy and Belle, he said. They're patient and steady. I thought I'd teach you to drive the wagon. Eleanor stared at him. Drive? Myself? Out here you'll need to. What if you need to get to town and I'm out with the herd? What if there's an emergency? He offered his hand to help her up to the driver's seat. Besides, it's not as hard as it looks. These girls know the way home even if you forget. For the next 2 hours, Graham patiently taught Eleanor the basics of driving a wagon. How to hold the reins, how to signal the horses, how to judge distance and navigate turns. She was terrible at first, nearly running them into a ditch twice, but Graham never lost patience. Gentle pressure, he coached, his hand over hers on the reins. They respond to subtle signals, not harsh ones. Think of it like a conversation, not a command. By the end of the lesson, Eleanor had managed to drive them in a complete circuit around the valley without incident. She felt absurdly proud of herself. You're a natural, Graham said, and she could tell he meant it. I nearly tipped us into a gully. But you didn't. That's what matters. Learning means making mistakes without giving up. On the 7th day, Sunday, Graham escorted Eleanor to church. The small white building was packed with townspeople and ranching families from the surrounding area. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes on her as they entered, but Graham's presence at her side was steadying. He led her to a pew near the front, and several people nodded greetings. Reverend Davis's sermon was about Ruth and Naomi, about leaving one's homeland for an uncertain future, about loyalty and faith in difficult circumstances. Eleanor wondered if he'd chosen the topic deliberately, but his delivery was thoughtful rather than pointed. After the service, Eleanor was introduced to what felt like half of Colorado. Names and faces blurred together, the blacksmith and his wife, the schoolteacher Miss Abernathy, the Johnsons who ran the hotel, the McLeod family with their 6 children, the widow Thompson who owned a small farm. But 2 people stood out. The first was a woman near Eleanor's age, blonde and pretty in a way that seemed almost artificial for frontier living. She approached with a sweet smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Graham, she said warmly, you didn't mention you'd be bringing anyone to church. Caroline, Graham said with polite coolness. This is Eleanor Price. Eleanor, Caroline Fletcher. Her father owns the Fletcher Ranch north of mine. The mail-order bride, Caroline said, her smile sharpening. How quaint. I do hope you're prepared for what you're getting into. Ranch life can be so demanding for someone from the city. Before Eleanor could respond, another woman appeared, older, perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and a face like granite. Caroline, she said sharply. Come along, your father's waiting. Of course, Mother. Caroline's smile didn't waver. Lovely to meet you, Miss Price. I'm sure we'll see more of each other. As the Fletchers walked away, Eleanor turned to Graham. Old friends? Graham's jaw was tight. The Fletchers have the ranch adjacent to mine. Caroline and I grew up together. There was some expectation, I suppose, that we might eventually marry. But I never encouraged it, and after my parents died, I made it clear I had no interest. He glanced down at Eleanor. She was not pleased when word got around that I'd sent for a bride. I gathered that. Don't let her bother you. Caroline's used to getting what she wants. She'll adjust to disappointment. The second memorable person was a small, elderly woman with bright black eyes like a bird. She appeared at Eleanor's elbow as if by magic. You're the one, she said without preamble, looking Eleanor up and down with unnerving intensity. Excuse me? You're the one Graham wrote to. I can see why. You've got backbone. You'll need it. She patted Eleanor's arm with surprising strength. I'm Ada Chen. I run the laundry, but mostly I watch people. Been here since the Silver Rush days, seen this town grow from nothing. You come see me if you need advice. Real advice, not the polite nonsense most folks will give you. Before Eleanor could respond, Ada had disappeared back into the crowd. What just happened? Eleanor asked Graham. He was smiling. That was Ada. She's something of a town oracle. If she likes you, you're set. Ada's approval means more than just about anyone's. She seemed to like me. She did. That's good. Graham offered his arm. Come on. There's one more person you should meet. He led her to an older man standing alone near the church gate, tall, rail-thin, with a weathered face and eyes the same gray-blue as Graham's. Uncle Samuel, Graham said warmly, I'd like you to meet Eleanor Price. Eleanor, this is my father's brother, Samuel Holt. Samuel studied Eleanor with the same direct gaze his nephew had. Then he smiled and his entire face transformed. Well now, Thomas would have liked you. You've got sense in your eyes. He shook her hand firmly. My nephew's a good man, miss. Bit stubborn, works too hard, doesn't laugh enough. But good clear through, you could do worse. Everyone keeps telling me that, Eleanor said, smiling. Because it's true. Now, when's the wedding? We Holts don't believe in long engagements. Uncle Samuel, Graham said with mild exasperation, we're taking our time, getting to know each other properly. Time's a luxury when you're young. At my age, you learn not to waste it. But Samuel's eyes were kind. Still, better to be sure than sorry. You both think it through, then do it right. As they walked back toward the boarding house after church, Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the weight of community expectations. Everyone assumes we're getting married. Does that bother you? I don't know, maybe. She struggled to articulate her feelings. It makes me feel like the decision's already been made, like I don't really have a choice. Graham stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Eleanor, look at me. When she met his eyes, he continued firmly, You have a choice, always. I don't care what the town thinks, what my uncle assumes, what anyone expects. This is between you and me, nobody else. If you decide you can't do this, I'll personally drive you back to Denver and put you on a train to wherever you want to go. With enough money to start fresh, I mean that. The absolute conviction in his voice steadied her. Thank you. Don't thank me for basic decency. He resumed walking, but his voice was gentler. I know the attention must feel like pressure. Small towns are like that. But try to see it differently. These people care. They want this to work out because they care about me and because they're ready to care about you. That's not a bad thing, even if it feels intrusive. On the 8th day, Graham took Eleanor back to the ranch, this time with a specific purpose. I want to teach you about the livestock, he said. If you're going to live here, you need to understand how the ranch operates. They spent the morning in the barns and pastures. Graham showed her how to recognize individual cattle. That's Bessie. She's the herd matriarch. Don't ever get between her and her calf. Explained the breeding schedule, demonstrated how to check for illness or injury. He introduced her to the horses, each with distinct personalities. There was Thunder, the big black stallion who was Graham's personal mount, gentle despite his intimidating size. There was Copper, a sorrel mare with a sweet disposition. And there was Old Jake, a gray gelding who'd been on the ranch since Graham was a boy. Want to try riding? Graham asked. Eleanor hesitated. She'd never been on a horse in her life. Is it difficult? Not on Copper. She's patient with beginners. Come on, I'll teach you. With Graham's help, Eleanor mounted Copper, her heart pounding. The ground seemed terribly far away, but Graham kept one hand on the bridle, the other at her knee, steadying her. Just feel her movement, he coached. Let your body move with her. Don't fight it. They walked slowly around the paddock, Graham leading Copper, until Eleanor began to relax into the rhythm. It was frightening and exhilarating all at once. You're doing great, Graham said, and the warmth in his voice made her feel like she'd accomplished something genuinely impressive. After the riding lesson, Graham took her to the vegetable garden, overgrown and neglected. My mother's pride, he said ruefully. I've let it go to seed. Literally. I keep meaning to fix it up, but there's never enough time. Eleanor knelt by the raised beds, pulling a few weeds experimentally. Beneath the neglect, She could see the bones of something well designed, good soil, solid construction, even a few stubborn plants still struggling to survive. I could work on this, she heard herself say. If I stay, I could bring it back. Graham crouched beside her, his hand resting on the wooden frame of the bed. She'd like that. Mother always said a good garden was half of what made a house a home. The other half was... He trailed off. Was what? Love, Graham said quietly. She said the other half was love. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not quite love, not yet, but something that might grow into it given time and care, like the garden itself. On the 9th day, Graham appeared with an unexpected proposal. I thought we might go on a picnic, up to a place that's special to me, if you're willing. Mrs. Holloway packed them a basket with enough food for a small army, and they set off in the wagon. The day was perfect, clear and warm, with a breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. They drove up into the foothills, following a track that wound between trees and across meadows starred with blue and yellow blossoms. After nearly an hour, Graham pulled the wagon to a stop. We walk from here. It's not far. He helped Eleanor down and took the picnic basket, leading her along a narrow trail. The trees closed in around them, dappling the path with shadow and light. Eleanor could hear water running somewhere ahead. They emerged into a clearing dominated by a spring, water bubbling up from between rocks, crystal clear, flowing into a small pool before trickling away as a stream. The pool was surrounded by flat stones perfect for sitting, and the clearing was filled with wildflowers. It was the most beautiful place Eleanor had ever seen. Oh, she breathed. Graham set down the basket, a small smile on his face. My father brought my mother here when he proposed. She said yes, right on that flat rock there. He pointed to a smooth stone at the water's edge. They used to come here on special occasions, called it the heart of the land. It's magical. It's just water and rocks, Graham said, but there was affection in his voice. But yeah, it feels special, private, like the rest of the world doesn't exist here. They spread a blanket and unpacked the basket. Cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of lemonade. They ate slowly, talking and watching the play of light on the water. After they'd eaten, Graham leaned back on his elbows, face tilted toward the sun. Eleanor, he said, I need to tell you something. Her heart jumped. All right. When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I was being practical, solving a problem, loneliness, needing help with the ranch. But then your letters started coming, and they were... He paused, choosing words carefully. They were you. Smart, honest, a little funny, a little sad, real. And I started looking forward to them like a kid waiting for Christmas. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Your letters were important to me too. When you stepped off that stagecoach, frozen with fear, I thought maybe I'd made a terrible mistake, asked too much of you. But then I saw something in your eyes. Not just fear, but determination. You were scared, but you were here anyway. That took courage. He sat up, turning to face her directly. What I'm trying to say is, this isn't practical anymore. Somewhere between the letters and watching you learn to drive a wagon and seeing you kneel in my mother's garden, somewhere in there, it became personal. Real. Eleanor's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying what started as a sensible arrangement has become something else. I'm halfway to loving you, Eleanor, and I need you to know that before you make your decision, because if you stay, it won't be just a partnership. Not for me. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Eleanor looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but patience and kindness, who'd given her choices when he didn't have to, who was offering his heart with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. Graham, she said softly, I ran away from Boston because I had no other option. That's true, but I'm not staying in Willow Ridge because I have nowhere else to go. I'm staying because... She took a breath, finding courage. Because somewhere between being terrified on that stagecoach and learning your mother loved flowers and watching you teach me to drive a wagon, somewhere in there, this became my choice. Not my only option, my choice. His expression transformed, hope lighting his eyes. You're staying? I'm staying, Eleanor confirmed. I'm halfway to loving you too, Graham Holt. And I think, given time, I might make it all the way there. The smile that broke across Graham's face was like sunrise. He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and when his lips met hers, it was gentle and careful and full of promise. Eleanor's free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. The kiss deepened, and she felt something inside her unfold like a flower, opening to sunlight, hope, possibility, the beginning of something true. When they finally pulled apart, Graham rested his forehead against hers. "We'll do this right," he said. "Proper courtship, proper wedding. I want you to be sure." "I am sure," Eleanor said, "but I appreciate the time anyway." They sat by the spring until the sun began to sink toward the mountains, talking about their future, about when they'd marry, about plans for the ranch, about the life they'd build together. As the light turned golden, Graham helped Eleanor to her feet. "One more thing," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a gold ring, simple, elegant, clearly old. "This was my mother's wedding ring. My father gave it to her 40 years ago. I'd like you to have it, not as an engagement ring yet, we'll wait for that, but as a promise. My promise that I'll do everything I can to make you happy." Eleanor looked at the ring, feeling the weight of history and hope it carried. "Are you sure? It's so precious, which is exactly why I want you to have it." Graham took the ring from the box and held it up. "Will you wear it, as a promise?" Eleanor held out her left hand, and Graham slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The gold was warm against her skin, worn smooth by years of being loved. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Graham said simply. As they drove back to town in the wagon, Eleanor kept looking at the ring on her finger, watching it catch the light. The weight of it felt right, felt like hope and home, and the future she'd been too afraid to imagine. When Graham dropped her at Mrs. Holloway's that evening, he helped her down from the wagon, but this time, instead of immediately releasing her, he pulled her close for another kiss. Longer this time, deeper, full of the promise they'd made to each other by the spring. "2 more days of courting," he said with a smile. "Then I'm going to talk to Reverend Davis about a wedding date." 2 more days, Eleanor agreed, her heart full. Inside, Mrs. Holloway took one look at Eleanor's face and the ring on her finger and smiled. "He asked you to stay." "He did, and I said yes." The older woman pulled Eleanor into a hug. "I knew the moment I saw you two together. Some things are just meant to be." She pulled back, holding Eleanor at arm's length. "Now, we have 2 days to prepare. A bride needs a proper dress, and I have just the thing." The 10th day was a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Holloway, Martha Garrett, and several other women of Willow Ridge descended on the boarding house with fabric, thread, and determination. They were altering a beautiful ivory dress that had belonged to Mrs. Holloway's daughter, making it fit Eleanor's slighter frame. "She wore it to her wedding 15 years ago," Mrs. Holloway explained, pins in her mouth as she worked. "Moved to San Francisco with her husband, never came back. But I kept the dress. Thought someday I might have use for it." Eleanor stood still as she could while they pinned and tucked, overwhelmed by the kindness of these women who barely knew her. Martha was adding lace at the cuffs, the lace she'd insisted Eleanor needed from the mercantile. Miss Abernathy, the school teacher, was embroidering tiny flowers on the hem. Even Ada Chen appeared, bringing a silk shawl she insisted every bride needed. "Something borrowed," Ada said, draping it over Eleanor's shoulders. "Bring it back after the wedding." It's too much," Eleanor protested, her eyes stinging with tears. "Nonsense," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. "This is what we do here. We take care of our own, and you're one of ours now." Graham spent the day at the ranch, making final preparations. When he came to the boarding house that evening for their last day of official courting, he seemed nervous in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before. "Everything all right?" she asked as they walked through town in the twilight. "Just thinking about tomorrow, hoping I don't mess up my vows." He smiled ruefully. "I'm better with cattle than with speeches." "Graham Holt," Eleanor said, stopping to face him. You don't need fancy speeches. Just say what you mean, like you always do. That's what I love about you. He caught the word, his eyes warming. Love? Eleanor felt her cheeks heat, but she didn't look away. I think so. Yes, I think I might actually love you. Whoa, Graham pulled her close, right there on the main street with people walking by. I know I love you, he said into her hair, absolutely certain of it. They stood there, wrapped in each other, while the town of Willow Ridge carried on around them. People heading home for supper, shopkeepers closing up, lamps being lit against the coming dark. And Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was exactly where she belonged. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. She woke before sunrise in Mrs. Holloway's blue room, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and nerves that made sleep impossible. The ivory dress hung on the wardrobe door, catching the first light, and her mother's cameo waited on the dresser beside Graham's mother's ring. In 2 hours, she would become Mrs. Graham Holt. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. 2 weeks ago, she'd been frozen on a stagecoach, unable to take that first step. Now she was about to take the biggest step of all, binding her life to a man she'd known for such a short time. But as she lay in bed watching the sky lighten through the lace curtains, Eleanor felt a calm certainty settle over her. This was right. Graham was right. The choice she'd made by that spring had been the truest thing she'd done in years. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor, dear, are you awake? Mrs. Holloway's voice was gentle. Yes, come in. Mrs. Holloway entered with a tray bearing coffee, toast, and scrambled eggs. You need to eat something, even if you don't feel like it. It's going to be a long day, and I won't have you fainting at the altar. Eleanor sat up, accepting the tray gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. Thank you for everything, the dress, the room, the kindness. I don't know how to repay you. You repay me by being happy, Mrs. Holloway said firmly, settling into the chair by the window, and by making that boy happy. Lord knows he deserves it. She smiled, her expression softening. I've known Graham since he was knee-high. Watched him grow up, watched him lose his parents, watched him struggle through grief and loneliness. When he told me he'd sent for a mail-order bride, I worried. Worried he was just trying to fill an empty space, not looking for real connection. But then I saw you two together, and I stopped worrying. We barely know each other, Eleanor said quietly. Sometimes that frightens me. Knowing someone isn't about time, it's about truth. You and Graham have been honest with each other from the start. That's better than a lifetime of polite pretense. Mrs. Holloway rose, brushing imaginary wrinkles from her skirt. Now finish eating. Martha and the others will be here soon to help you dress. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity. Martha Garrett arrived with her arms full of wildflowers for a bouquet. Miss Abernathy brought ribbons for Eleanor's hair. Ada Chen appeared with the silk shawl and a mysterious jar of ointment she insisted would make Eleanor's skin glow. Even the minister's wife, Mrs. Patterson, came bearing a blue garter. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, she recited, ticking items off on her fingers. The dress is old, the flowers are new, Ada's shawl is borrowed, and here's your blue. They dressed Eleanor with the care usually reserved for royalty. The ivory dress fit perfectly after all the alterations, the lace at the cuffs delicate and beautiful. Martha had fashioned the wildflowers into a simple but stunning bouquet. Purple lupine, yellow columbine, white daisies tied with ribbons. Ada insisted on braiding Eleanor's dark hair in an intricate pattern, weaving in small white flowers. Mrs. Holloway fastened the cameo at Eleanor's throat, her eyes suspiciously bright. Your mother would be so proud, she whispered. When Eleanor finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked radiant, transformed not just by the dress and flowers, but by something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or joy, or simply the glow of a woman who'd found her place in the world. Graham's going to lose his mind when he sees you, Martha said with satisfaction. At the church, Graham stood at the altar trying not to fidget. He'd worn his best suit, dark wool that he usually reserved for funerals and rare trips to Denver, and a new shirt his Uncle Samuel had insisted on buying. His hair was freshly cut, his boots polished to a shine that would have made his mother proud. But his hands wouldn't stay still, constantly adjusting his collar, checking his pocket for the ring, smoothing his jacket. "Relax," Uncle Samuel said from beside him, serving as best man. "She's not going to run." "I know that," Graham muttered, though he'd had nightmares about exactly that scenario. "Do you? Because you look like a man waiting for the sky to fall." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "That girl chose you, nephew. Chose you when she could have gone anywhere, done anything. Have some faith." Reverend Davis approached, his Bible in hand, a kind smile on his weathered face. "Almost time. The church is full. Seems like the whole town turned out. You ready?" Graham took a deep breath, looking around the small church. It was indeed packed. He saw the Garretts in the third row, Dr. Webb near the back, the McLeod family taking up an entire pew with their numerous children. Even some of his ranch hands had cleaned up and come to town. The Fletcher family was conspicuously absent, which was fine by Graham. He didn't need Caroline's disapproving presence on his wedding day. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it. The church grew quiet as Mrs. Holloway took her seat in the front row. Then Miss Abernathy, who had musical talent, began playing the small pump organ, and the opening notes of a wedding hymn filled the space. The door at the back of the church opened, and Eleanor appeared. Graham's breath stopped in his chest. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he'd imagined, ethereal in the ivory dress with flowers in her hair and a bouquet in her hands. But it wasn't just the dress or the flowers that made her stunning. It was the look on her face as her eyes found his across the length of the church, pure joy, unmixed with doubt or fear. She began walking down the aisle, and Graham found himself moving to meet her halfway, unable to wait as tradition demanded. Reverend Davis chuckled softly, and a ripple of amusement went through the congregation, but Graham didn't care. He reached Eleanor in the middle of the aisle, offering his arm. "Couldn't wait?" she whispered, her eyes sparkling. "Not one more second," he replied. They walked the rest of the way together, and when they turned to face Reverend Davis, Graham couldn't stop looking at her. The morning sun streaming through the windows turned her dark hair to mahogany, and the small smile playing at her lips made his heart race. Reverend Davis opened his Bible, but before he could begin the ceremony, he looked at them both with that kind, knowing expression. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying through the church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Graham James Holt and Eleanor Catherine Price in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." He paused, looking directly at Graham and Eleanor. "I've known Graham since he was a boy. I knew his parents, married them in this very church. I knew his mother Sarah's devotion, his father Thomas's strength. I've watched Graham grow into a man of integrity and character, watched him weather losses that would break lesser men. And 2 weeks ago, I met Eleanor, a woman who crossed a continent on faith, who chose courage over comfort, who saw in our rough frontier town the possibility of home." Graham felt Eleanor's hand tighten on his arm. "These two have chosen each other," Reverend Davis continued, "not out of convenience, not out of desperation, but out of honest recognition of something real and true. That kind of foundation built on honesty and respect is what sustains a marriage through hard times. And make no mistake, there will be hard times. But there will also be joy, partnership, and love that deepens with every shared sunrise." He looked down at his Bible. "Graham, do you take Eleanor to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Graham turned to face Eleanor fully, holding both her hands in his. "I do," he said clearly, his voice steady. "Eleanor, I promise you I'll work every day to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me. I promise to listen when you speak, to support your dreams, to share the burden and the joy of building our life together. I promise to remember that you chose me, and to never take that choice for granted." Eleanor's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. Reverend Davis nodded approvingly, then turned to Eleanor. "Eleanor, do you take Graham to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish. Till death do you part. Eleanor's voice was clear and strong. I do. Graham, I promise to embrace this life we're building, to learn and grow alongside you. I promise to be honest even when it's hard, to work beside you in the difficult times, to celebrate with you in the good times. I promise to make our house a home and to remember every day that love is a choice I'm grateful to make. Graham felt something fierce and protective surge through him. This woman, who'd been so terrified stepping off that stagecoach, was now standing before the entire town making vows with unwavering certainty. She was stronger than she knew, and he was going to spend his life proving to her just how extraordinary she was. The rings? Reverend Davis prompted. Uncle Samuel produced a simple gold band that had belonged to Graham's father. Graham took it, holding it at the tip of Eleanor's finger. With this ring I thee wed, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He slid the ring onto her finger where it joined his mother's ring already there. The sight of both rings on her hand, binding past to future, made his throat tight. Eleanor took the ring Mrs. Holloway had discreetly provided, purchased by the collective effort of the town's women, Graham would learn later, and held it to his finger. With this ring I thee wed, she repeated, sliding it home. The metal was warm against his skin, a tangible reminder of the promises they'd just made. Reverend Davis placed his hand over their joined hands. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He smiled. Graham, you may kiss your bride. Graham cupped Eleanor's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. Hello, Mrs. Holt, he whispered. Hello, husband, she whispered back. And then he kissed her, pouring into it all the emotion of the past 2 weeks, the hope, the fear, the growing certainty that this woman was meant for him. The church erupted in applause and cheers, but Graham barely heard it. All that existed was Eleanor in his arms, kissing him back with equal fervor, her hands gripping his lapels as if she'd never let go. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Reverend Davis was grinning. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Graham Holt. More cheers, louder this time. Graham tucked Eleanor's hand into the crook of his arm, and they walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife. Outside the church, the bright sunshine made them both blink. The townspeople followed, crowding around with congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Holloway was crying openly now, hugging Eleanor and then Graham. Be happy, both of you, that's all I ask. Martha Garrett kissed Eleanor's cheek. Welcome to the family, dear. Willow Ridge is your home now. Dr. Webb shook Graham's hand firmly. You chose well. Take care of her. Always, Graham promised. Uncle Samuel pulled them both into a bear hug. Your parents would be so proud, he said to Graham, his voice thick. Sarah loved weddings. She'd have been beside herself with joy today. The words hit Graham harder than expected. His mother would have loved Eleanor, her intelligence, her determination, her kindness. His father would have approved of her backbone, her willingness to face challenges head on. For a moment, grief and joy tangled in his chest, and Eleanor must have sensed it because she squeezed his hand. They're here in spirit, she said softly. I feel it. Ada Chen appeared with that uncanny timing of hers. Good wedding. Strong start. Come see me next week. I'll teach you how to make the herbs for preventing babies until you're ready. Man and woman should decide these things together. Eleanor's cheeks flamed red, but she nodded. Thank you, Ada. The reception was held at the hotel, the largest building in town with a dining room that could accommodate the crowd. Tables had been pushed together and laden with food, contributed by seemingly everyone. Roasted chickens, beef, fresh bread, preserves, pies, cakes. Someone had brought a fiddle, and cheerful music filled the air. Graham and Eleanor sat at the head table, plates piled with food neither could quite manage to eat. They were too aware of each other, of the weight of the rings on their fingers, of the fact that tonight they'd go home together as husband and wife. Nervous? Graham asked quietly, under the cover of the surrounding noise. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. You? Same. He found her hand under the table, lacing their fingers together. But we'll figure it out. Together. After the meal, there was dancing. The fiddle player launched into a lively reel, and couples took to the makeshift dance floor. Graham stood, offering his hand to Eleanor. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Holt?" She smiled, taking his hand. "You may, Mr. Holt." They moved onto the floor, and Graham put his hand at her waist, taking her other hand in his. He wasn't a graceful dancer, never had been, but Eleanor followed his lead without complaint, laughing when he nearly stepped on her toes. "I should have warned you," he said ruefully. "I'm better at wrangling cattle than waltzing." "I don't care," Eleanor said, her eyes bright. "This is perfect." They danced 3 more songs, then Uncle Samuel cut in, insisting on a dance with the bride. Graham found himself next to Dr. Webb, who was watching the festivities with amusement. "You look happy," the doctor observed. "I am," Graham said, watching Eleanor laugh at something his uncle said. "Happier than I've been in 5 years. Maybe longer." "Good. You deserve it." Webb paused, then added, "Marriage is work, you know, especially in the beginning. Don't expect it to be easy just because you're in love, but if you're both willing to put in the effort, it's the most rewarding work there is." Graham nodded, filing away the advice. "Thank you." The afternoon wore on. More dancing, more food, countless toasts to the happy couple. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the town, Graham caught Eleanor's eye. She nodded slightly, understanding without words that they were both ready to leave. They made their way through the crowd, thanking people for coming, accepting final congratulations. Mrs. Holloway pressed a basket into Eleanor's hands. "Supplies for tonight and breakfast tomorrow. You won't want to cook." Outside, Graham's wagon waited, freshly washed and decorated with ribbons and flowers by some of the town's women. His best horses, Thunder and Copper, stood in the traces. Graham helped Eleanor up to the seat, then climbed up beside her. The crowd had followed them outside, and as Graham picked up the reins, they showered the wagon with rice and flower petals. Eleanor laughed, shielding her face, and Graham clicked to the horses. They rolled out of town, accompanied by cheers and shouts of good wishes. The moment they left Willow Ridge behind, climbing into the foothills toward the ranch, a comfortable quiet settled over them. The sun was painting the mountains gold and purple. The air was cooling with evening's approach, and the rhythmic clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels provided a peaceful soundtrack. "Well," Eleanor said after a while, "we did it." "We did." Graham glanced at her, taking in the flowers still in her hair, the ivory dress glowing in the fading light, the contentment on her face. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." "You?" "Only that I didn't kiss you longer when Reverend Davis gave me permission." Eleanor laughed, the sound like bells. "We have time to make up for that." They drove on, and as the ranch came into view in the valley below, Graham felt a rightness settle into his bones. There it was. Home. And now it was Eleanor's home too, not just as a visitor but as his wife, his partner, the woman who would help him build a future in this place. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The dogs came running, barking their greetings, and Eleanor reached down to pet them. "Hello, boys." "Yes, I'm home. This is home now." Graham climbed down and came around to help Eleanor from the wagon. But instead of simply taking her hand, he swept her up into his arms, making her gasp with surprise. "Graham, what are you doing?" "Carrying you over the threshold," he said, starting toward the house. "It's tradition." "It's also unnecessary," Eleanor protested, but she was laughing, her arms around his neck. "Maybe so. But I've been thinking about this moment for 2 weeks, and I'm not about to skip it now." He carried her up the porch steps, pushed open the door with his shoulder, and stepped inside. The house was dim with approaching evening, but warm and welcoming. He'd left lamps ready to light, laid wood in the fireplace, prepared everything as much as he could. Gently, he set Eleanor on her feet. She looked around, taking in the main room, their home now, with fresh eyes. "It feels different," she said softly, "now that I'm not just visiting." "Good, different, or bad, different?" "Good. Real." She turned to face him, reaching up to cup his cheek. "Graham, I need to tell you something." His heart jumped nervously. All right. I'm scared, she admitted. About tonight, about being a wife, about all of it. I don't want to disappoint you. Relief flooded through him. Eleanor, I'm scared too. I haven't. It's been a long time since I've shared my life with anyone. I'm going to make mistakes. We both are. But that's all right. We'll learn together. He covered her hand with his. And as for tonight, we'll go at whatever pace feels right. There's no rush. We have the rest of our lives. Her eyes softened. How did I get so lucky? I've been asking myself the same question about you for 2 weeks. He leaned down, kissing her gently. Now let me light some lamps, get a fire going. It'll be full dark soon. He moved through the house lighting lamps, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. Eleanor followed, watching as he coaxed a fire to life in the hearth. The wood caught quickly, crackling cheerfully, and soon the room was filled with golden light. There, Graham said with satisfaction. That's better. Now, Mrs. Holloway packed us food, but I'm not particularly hungry. Are you? Not really. Too much excitement. Eleanor was still standing in the middle of the room, looking slightly lost. Graham recognized that look, the uncertainty of not quite knowing where she belonged yet in this space. He held out his hand. Come sit with me. Let's just be for a while. They settled on the sofa near the fire, and gradually Eleanor relaxed against him, her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance, the tension of the day slowly draining away. Tell me about your first memory of this house, Eleanor said eventually. Graham thought back. I must have been about 3 years old. My father was building an addition, the spare bedroom. I remember watching him work, how the saw made sawdust fly, how the pieces of wood gradually became something bigger. Mother brought us lunch outside, and we all sat on the porch eating sandwiches. I thought my father could build anything, make anything. He seemed invincible. What changed? Reality, I suppose. As I got older, I saw him struggle, saw the worry when cattle prices dropped or winter lasted too long, saw him age with the work and the worry. But I never stopped admiring him. Even when I realized he wasn't invincible, I respected him more for keeping going despite the challenges. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I hope I can be like that. Strong when it matters. You already are, Graham said firmly. You stepped off that stagecoach despite being terrified. You chose to stay despite uncertainty. You married me despite barely knowing me. That's strength, Eleanor. She tilted her head to look up at him. Kiss me again. He did, thoroughly this time, and Eleanor responded with a passion that surprised and delighted him. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Graham's heart was racing. We should probably talk about expectations, he said, trying to be practical despite the desire coursing through him. For tonight. For our marriage. I don't want to assume. Eleanor put her finger to his lips, stopping him. I know what happens between a husband and wife. I'm not completely naive, and I want that with you. But you're right that I'm nervous, so maybe we take it slow? Learn each other gradually? That sounds perfect, Graham said, relieved and touched by her honesty. There's no script we have to follow, no timeline. This is ours to figure out together. She smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. I like that, ours. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from practical matters, where she'd keep her things, how they'd divide household tasks, to more personal topics. Eleanor told him about her mother's death, about nursing her through the final illness, about the loneliness that had followed. Graham shared memories of his parents, particularly his mother's last days, and found that talking about it with Eleanor eased some of the old grief. Eventually, Eleanor yawned, exhaustion catching up with her. I'm sorry. It's been such a long day. Don't apologize. Let me show you. He paused, suddenly awkward. Our bedroom. He led her through the house to the main bedroom, his parents' old room, the room he'd been using since their deaths. But he'd prepared it carefully, adding feminine touches he thought she'd appreciate. Fresh curtains, new quilts, wildflowers in a vase on the dresser. Her trunk, sent ahead from Mrs. Holloway's, stood at the foot of the bed. I wasn't sure how you'd want to arrange things, Graham said. The dresser is empty. You can have whichever drawers you want. The wardrobe, too. And if you want to change anything, redecorate, that's fine. This is your room now, as much as mine. Eleanor walked slowly around the space, touching things, the curtains, the quilt, the flowers. You did all this? Wanted you to feel welcome. She turned to face him, tears in her eyes. Graham Holt, you are the most thoughtful man I've ever known. He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. I just want you to be happy here. I am happy, nervous, but happy. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Will you help me with my dress? The buttons are in back. Graham's mouth went dry. Of course. With slightly shaking hands, he began unfastening the long row of tiny buttons down her back. It took concentration, and he was acutely aware of the warm skin being revealed, the way Eleanor shivered slightly under his touch. When he finished, she held the dress to her chest, suddenly shy. I packed a nightgown, she said, gesturing to her trunk. I'll step out, Graham offered. Give you privacy to change. Thank you. He retreated to the main room, giving her time. His own heart was pounding. He'd been married for all of 6 hours, and already he felt like his life had transformed completely. There was a woman in his bedroom, his wife, preparing for bed. After 5 years of solitude, after months of wondering if he'd made the right choice sending for a mail-order bride, here he was with a future stretching ahead that looked nothing like the lonely years behind. Graham? Eleanor's voice called. You can come back. He returned to find her in a white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking impossibly young and vulnerable. The dress lay carefully over a chair, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed, nervous hands clasped in her lap. Graham quickly changed into his own nightshirt, feeling just as awkward as she looked. When he turned back, Eleanor had slipped under the covers, watching him with wide eyes. He crossed to the other side of the bed, climbing in carefully, leaving space between them. For a moment, they both lay on their backs, staring at the ceiling, the situation suddenly absurd. This is ridiculous, Eleanor said, and there was a note of laughter in her voice. We're married. We're allowed to be close to each other. Graham chuckled. You're right. He turned on his side, propping himself up on one elbow. Come here. Eleanor shifted closer, and Graham wrapped his arm around her, pulling her against him. She fit perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her hand resting on his chest over his heart. Better? He asked. Much better. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Graham? I'm glad I answered your advertisement. Glad I got on that train. Glad I stepped off that stagecoach, even though I was terrified. All of it led here, to this moment, and I wouldn't change any of it. Graham tightened his arms around her, emotion thick in his throat. Neither would I. Not a single moment. They lay there in the lamplight, the house settling around them with creaks and sighs, the fire crackling in the distance. Gradually, Eleanor's breathing evened out, and Graham realized she'd fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted by the day's emotions. He carefully reached over and turned down the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the faint glow from the main room's fire. Then he settled back, holding his wife, and felt a contentment he hadn't known was possible. Tomorrow would bring work, adjustments, the challenges of learning to live together. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The mail-order bride who'd been too afraid to step down from the stagecoach was now sleeping peacefully in his arms, her choice made, her future begun. Graham pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Sweet dreams, Mrs. Holt, he whispered, and then, for the first time in 5 long years, he fell asleep not alone, but with hope and love beside him. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar sounds, the crowing of roosters, the lowing of distant cattle, and closer, the steady breathing of someone beside her. For a moment, disoriented, she couldn't place where she was. Then memory flooded back, and with it, awareness of the warm, solid presence of Graham's body curved around hers, his arm draped protectively across her waist. She was married. This was her home, her life. The realization was both comforting and overwhelming. Eleanor lay still, watching pale dawn light filter through the curtains Graham had hung for her, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up. She'd spent her entire life in Boston, where mornings meant the clatter of carriages on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the general din of city life. This was quieter, but no less alive. just a different kind of alive. Graham stirred behind her, his arm tightening briefly before he seemed to wake fully. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, suddenly shy. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder, then sat up, running a hand through his tousled hair. "I should get up. Cattle need checking, horses need feeding, ranch doesn't run itself." But he didn't move immediately, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart flutter. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "You?" "Best sleep I've had in 5 years." He leaned down, kissing her properly this time. A good morning kiss that was both tender and promising. "I'll get the fire going, make coffee. You can sleep more if you want." "No, I should get up too. Learn the routine." Eleanor pushed herself upright, acutely aware that her hair was probably a disaster, and she had no idea what a ranch wife was supposed to do first thing in the morning. "What time is it?" "Just past dawn. About 6, I'd guess." Graham was already pulling on his work clothes. Worn denim pants, a flannel shirt, sturdy boots. "Normally I'm up before sunrise, but I figured today we could ease into things." Eleanor climbed out of bed, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. "Show me what needs doing. I want to help." Graham paused in the act of buttoning his shirt, looking at her with something like admiration. "All right, but first, breakfast. Can't work on an empty stomach." They moved into the main room where Graham quickly rekindled the fire and set coffee on the stove. Eleanor watched, trying to memorize the process, how much wood, where he kept the kindling, how he adjusted the stove's damper for the right heat. When he started pulling out supplies for breakfast, she stepped in. "Let me," she said. "I can at least cook eggs and bacon. Mother taught me that much." Graham handed over the pan with a small smile. "All yours then." Working side by side in the kitchen, they fell into an easy rhythm. Eleanor cooked while Graham set the table, poured coffee, sliced bread. It was domestic and ordinary and somehow more intimate than anything they'd shared the night before. This was real life, the daily partnership they'd committed to. "Not bad," Graham said after his first bite of eggs. "Better than I usually manage for myself." "That's a low bar," Eleanor teased. "What do you usually eat?" "Whatever's fastest. Bacon, bread, maybe some beans if I'm feeling ambitious. Mother used to make these incredible breakfasts, pancakes, biscuits, gravy. I never learned. Seemed too complicated." "Then I'll learn," Eleanor said. "We can't live on eggs and bacon forever." After breakfast, Graham led her outside to begin teaching her the basics of ranch life. The morning was crisp and clear, the mountains sharp against a brilliant blue sky. The air smelled of pine, earth, and animals, so different from Boston's coal smoke and sea salt that Eleanor had to stop and just breathe it in. "First things first," Graham said, leading her to the chicken coop. "Meet the ladies." A dozen chickens scattered and clucked as they entered. Graham showed her where they nested, how to collect eggs without disturbing them too much, which hens were friendly and which would peck given the chance. "This is Henrietta," he said, pointing to a particularly plump red hen. "She's the boss of the whole operation. Don't argue with her. You'll lose." Eleanor carefully gathered eggs into a basket, delighted by the warm weight of them, the earthy smell of the coop. "How often do we collect?" "Twice a day, morning and evening. They'll lay more consistently if you keep to a schedule." Graham scattered feed from a bucket, and the chickens swarmed around his feet. "We usually get 8 to 10 eggs a day depending on the season. More in spring and summer, fewer in winter." Next, he took her to the barn where the horses nickered greetings. Eleanor recognized Thunder and Copper, along with several others she'd seen before. Graham demonstrated how to measure out feed, how to check their water troughs, how to inspect their hooves for stones or injury. "Horses are smart," he said, stroking Thunder's velvety nose. "Treat them with respect and they'll work their hearts out for you. Treat them poorly and they'll remember forever. Never approach from behind. Always let them see you coming, and if one seems off, not eating, acting strange, come get me immediately." They moved through the morning chores together, Graham explaining everything patiently. Eleanor learned where he kept tools, how to tell which cattle were part of their herd versus neighbors' strays, the locations of different pastures and water sources. It was overwhelming. So much information, so many new skills to master, but Graham never made her feel foolish for asking questions. "You're doing great," he said as they headed back to the house for lunch. Most city folks would be completely lost. I'm completely lost, Eleanor admitted. But I'm trying. That's all that matters. He caught her hand, pulling her to a stop. Eleanor, I don't expect you to know everything immediately. This life, it takes time to learn. Just don't give up, all right? I won't, she promised. This is my home now. I want to learn. Over the next several days, they established a routine. Eleanor rose with Graham each morning, learning to prepare larger breakfasts as her confidence grew. She took over the chicken care entirely, finding she enjoyed the simple rhythm of collecting eggs and tending the birds. Graham taught her to milk the cow, a patient creature named Bessie who tolerated Eleanor's clumsy first attempts with remarkable grace. In the afternoons, while Graham worked on fence repairs or checked distant pastures, Eleanor tackled the house. She cleaned thoroughly, unpacked her few belongings, and began making small changes to personalize the space. She moved furniture slightly, arranged wildflowers in unexpected places, organized the kitchen to make more sense. Graham never objected, seeming pleased that she was making it her home too. The neglected vegetable garden became her special project. She spent hours pulling weeds, turning soil, identifying which plants might be salvaged. Dr. Webb, true to his word, came by one afternoon with a bag of seed packets and gardening advice. Your mother-in-law had the best garden in 3 counties, he told Eleanor, kneeling beside her in the dirt. She grew medicinal herbs too, feverfew for headaches, chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain. I'll show you which ones if you're interested. I am, Eleanor said eagerly. Very interested. Webb smiled. Good. A doctor can't be everywhere at once. Having capable people who know basic medicine scattered around the territory makes my job possible. He spent the afternoon teaching her, and Eleanor absorbed every word. Here was something useful, something that could help people. In Boston, her education had been ornamental: French, embroidery, piano, all the things considered proper for a young lady. Here, knowledge had practical application. She could use what she learned to make a real difference. As the days passed, Eleanor and Graham grew more comfortable with each other. They laughed together over dinner, sat close in the evenings reading or talking, shared the easy intimacy of people learning to be partners. At night, in the big bed they now shared without awkwardness, they explored the physical side of their marriage slowly, tenderly, with mutual care and growing passion. I love you, Graham said one night, holding her close in the darkness. I know I said it before, but now I really understand it. You're not just my wife, you're my best friend. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too, more than I thought possible so quickly. But not everything was perfect. One afternoon, about a week after the wedding, Eleanor was hanging laundry when she heard a rider approaching. She looked up to see a woman on a fine bay horse, Caroline Fletcher, impeccably dressed even for riding, her blonde hair perfectly arranged under her hat. Mrs. Holt, Caroline said with that same sharp smile. How domestic you look. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, determined not to be intimidated. Miss Fletcher, what brings you by? Neighborly courtesy. I thought I should welcome you properly, without the whole town watching. Caroline dismounted gracefully, tying her horse to the porch rail. May I come in? Eleanor had little choice but to invite her inside. She offered coffee, which Caroline accepted, settling at the kitchen table as if she owned the place. So, Caroline said, stirring honey into her cup, how are you finding ranch life? Not quite what you expected, I imagine. It's everything I hoped for, Eleanor said evenly. Really? The isolation, the endless work, the harsh conditions? Caroline's tone was sweetly poisonous. I grew up on a ranch, you see. I know what it takes. And I know Graham, known him all my life, actually. We understand each other in ways an outsider never could. Eleanor felt anger spark but kept her voice calm. Then I'm sure you're happy for him. For us. Oh, of course. Though I do wonder, Caroline paused delicately, how long it will last. Mail-order marriages often don't, you know. Once the novelty wears off, once reality sets in. Graham's used to his independence, his routines. Having someone underfoot all the time might grow tiresome. I think Graham can speak for himself about what he finds tiresome, Eleanor said, her patience fraying. Can he? Or will he just be too polite to say anything until one day he simply leaves? Caroline leaned forward, her eyes sharp. I've seen it happen, Mrs. Holt. Women come west thinking they can adapt, thinking love will be enough. But when the first hard winter hits, when they realize what they've truly committed to, they run back east. Or worse, they stay and make everyone around them miserable. I'm not planning to run, Eleanor said firmly. This is my home. For now. Caroline stood, smoothing her riding skirt. Well, I should go. Do give Graham my regards. Tell him if he ever needs anything, advice, help, company, he knows where to find me. After she left, Eleanor stood at the window watching her ride away, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. She'd met women like Caroline in Boston, women who viewed other women as competition, who couldn't stand to see someone else happy with a man they'd wanted for themselves. When Graham returned that evening, Eleanor was quieter than usual. Over dinner, he noticed. Something wrong? He asked. Eleanor debated keeping it to herself, then decided against it. They'd promised honesty. Caroline Fletcher came by today. Graham's expression darkened. What did she want? To welcome me, and to make sure I knew she and you have history, that she understands you better than I ever could, and that mail-order marriages rarely last. Eleanor looked down at her plate. She basically implied I'll either run back to Boston or make you miserable. That's... Graham bit off what was probably a curse. Eleanor, look at me. She met his eyes. Caroline Fletcher is bitter because I never wanted what she wanted. She assumed we'd marry eventually, based on nothing but proximity and her own expectations. When I made it clear I wasn't interested, she took it personally, and when I sent for you, it was salt in the wound. He reached across the table, taking her hand. She doesn't know me, not really. She knows the boy I was, not the man I've become. And she certainly doesn't know us, what we have together. But what if she's right? Eleanor heard herself ask. What if when winter comes, when things get really hard, I'm not strong enough? Graham stood, pulling her up with him. Listen to me. You are strong enough. You've already proven that, leaving Boston, coming here, learning this life. But even if you weren't, even if you did struggle, we'd figure it out together. That's what marriage means. We don't face hard times alone anymore. Eleanor leaned into him, letting his certainty steady her. Promise me something? Anything. If I do something wrong, if I'm not good at this, tell me. Don't just quietly resent me. Let me fix it. I promise. Same goes for you. If I'm too set in my ways, if I'm not making you happy, speak up. He tilted her chin up, kissing her gently. We're partners, Eleanor. Equal partners. Don't let Caroline or anyone else make you doubt that. The incident with Caroline, unsettling as it was, ultimately brought Eleanor and Graham closer. They talked more openly about fears and insecurities, about the challenges they knew lay ahead. And when Caroline rode past on the road a few days later and saw Eleanor and Graham working side by side, repairing a fence, laughing together over some shared joke, she didn't stop to visit. As June turned to July, Eleanor began to find her rhythm. The morning chores became automatic. She experimented with cooking, using Mrs. Holloway's recipes and her own instincts to create meals that made Graham close his eyes in appreciation. The garden flourished under her care, producing early lettuce and radishes. She learned to ride properly, progressing from gentle copper to more spirited horses. One afternoon, Graham came in to find Eleanor elbow-deep in bread dough, flour dusting her nose, humming to herself. He stopped in the doorway, just watching, and his heart expanded with something too large for words. What? Eleanor asked, noticing his stare. You look happy, he said simply. I am happy? She kneaded the dough, her movements growing more confident. This morning, I collected 14 eggs, milked Bessie in half the time it used to take, and convinced that stubborn hen Henrietta to let me check her nest without pecking me. This afternoon, I'm making bread from scratch. Next week, I'm going to help you move the cattle to the summer pasture. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. I'm doing this, Graham. I'm actually doing this. He crossed to her, pulling her flour-covered self into his arms. You're not just doing it. You're excelling at it. Don't get ahead of yourself, she said, but she was smiling. I still can't rope a calf. I'm terrible at shooting, and I don't understand half of what you say about cattle breeding. Yet, Graham said, you can't do those things yet, but you will. He was right. Over the following weeks, Graham taught Eleanor to shoot, starting with tin cans on fence posts and progressing to hunting rabbits for dinner. She learned to read the weather by watching cloud formations and animal behavior. She memorized which plants were safe for cattle and which were poisonous. Graham showed her the boundaries of their land, explaining how water rights worked, pointing out where neighbors' property began. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Graham said, "I need to go to Denver in a few weeks. Cattle auction. Usually I'm gone 4 or 5 days. I could arrange for someone to stay here with you, or you could come with me." "I'll come with you," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I'd like to see Denver, and I don't want to be apart that long." Graham smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." They made the trip in early August, taking the wagon down the mountain roads to the city. Denver was booming, 3 times larger than when Graham's parents had first passed through 30 years ago. Eleanor found it exciting and overwhelming in equal measure. The noise, the crowds, the sheer bustle of commerce reminded her of Boston, but with a raw, unfinished edge that was purely Western. Graham conducted his business at the stockyards, selling off some of the spring calves for good prices. Eleanor accompanied him, learning about the auction process, meeting other ranchers and their wives. Several of the women pulled her aside with advice and stories, welcoming her to what one called the sorority of women who chose this crazy life. "It's not easy," Mrs. Anderson, a rancher's wife of 20 years, told her over lunch, "but it's rewarding in ways city life never could be. You're building something real, something that matters. And the freedom, oh, the freedom of it. No stuffy social calls, no pretending to be something you're not. Out here, you're judged by what you do, not who your family was." The words resonated with Eleanor. In Boston, she'd been judged by her father's failures, by her lack of prospects, by her inability to maintain the social facade. Here, she was creating her own identity based on her actions and choices. Graham had booked them a room at a decent hotel, and that night, away from the ranch for the first time, they made love with a passion and freedom that surprised them both. The walls were thinner than at home, but somehow that didn't matter. They were young, in love, and starting to truly understand what it meant to be partners in every sense. "Happy?" Graham asked afterward, holding her close. "Deliriously," Eleanor said. "Though I miss the ranch. Isn't that strange? We've only been gone 2 days and I miss home." "Not strange at all. It means it's really become home." They returned to Willow Ridge with supplies, gifts for friends, and a renewed sense of purpose. But they also returned to find trouble brewing. Uncle Samuel met them on the road before they reached town, his face grim. "Graham, we've got problems. Someone's been cutting fences up north near Fletcher property. Lost about 20 head of your cattle. They wandered onto Fletcher land, and John Fletcher's claiming they're his now." Graham's jaw tightened. "The hell they are. Those cattle are branded with my mark." "I know that, you know that, Fletcher knows that. But he's saying possession is 9/10 of the law." Samuel glanced at Eleanor apologetically. "Sorry, ma'am. Didn't mean to dump this on you right after you got back." "It's fine," Eleanor said, though her stomach had knotted with anxiety. "What can we do?" Graham's expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "We can do this the legal way or the hard way. I'd prefer legal, but I'm prepared for either." They drove straight to the ranch, where Graham immediately began organizing. He sent word to his hired hands, wrote a letter to the territorial judge in Denver, and prepared to ride to the Fletcher ranch to confront John Fletcher directly. "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said. "No," Graham said immediately. "Fletcher's unpredictable. Could get ugly." "Which is exactly why I'm coming. You need a witness, someone who can testify if this goes to court." Eleanor set her jaw stubbornly. "I'm your wife, Graham. I'm not hiding at home while you face trouble alone." Graham looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you stay back. Let me do the talking. And if shooting starts—" "Shooting?" Eleanor's voice went up an octave. "Probably won't come to that," Graham said, strapping on his gun belt. "But Fletcher's got a temper, and he doesn't take kindly to being challenged." They rode out that afternoon, Eleanor on Copper, Graham on Thunder. Uncle Samuel and 2 of Graham's hired hands, Tom and Pete, came along as backup. The Fletcher ranch was larger than Graham's, sprawling across a wide valley with more cattle than Eleanor could count. John Fletcher met them in his yard, a big man gone to fat, with a florid face and calculating eyes. Caroline stood on the porch, watching with barely concealed satisfaction. "Holt," Fletcher said without preamble, "what brings you to my property?" "You know damn well what brings me," Graham said, his voice level but cold. "You've got 20 head of my cattle. I want them back. Those cattle were on my land, eating my grass. That makes them mine. Those cattle have my brand. That makes them mine. And we both know how they got on your land. Someone cut my fence. I'm betting I know who." Fletcher's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation. You got proof?" "Working on it, but right now I don't care about proof. I care about my cattle." Graham leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping dangerously. "I'm giving you one chance to do this the easy way. Return my cattle, and we'll call it a misunderstanding. Keep them, and I'll take this to the territorial court. Either way, I'm getting my property back." "You always were stubborn, boy. Just like your father." Fletcher spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "And look where that got him. Froze to death checking on cattle in a blizzard. Being stubborn killed him." Eleanor saw Graham's hands tighten on the reins, saw the rage flash across his face before he controlled it. "My father died doing his job. There's honor in that. What's your excuse going to be when everyone knows you're a cattle thief?" The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Fletcher's face went red, and his hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Immediately, Tom and Pete moved their horses forward, hands on their own weapons. "Easy," Uncle Samuel said, his voice carrying authority. "No call for this to get violent. John, you and Graham have been neighbors for 30 years. Your fathers were friends. Don't let this get out of hand over a few cattle." Fletcher's hand paused. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually grab the rifle. Then Caroline spoke from the porch. "Daddy, just give him his cattle. Everyone in 3 counties knows they're his. You'll look foolish fighting it." Fletcher shot his daughter a venomous look, but something in her words seemed to penetrate. "Fine," he spat. "Take your damn cattle. Pete," he shouted to one of his hands. "Round up those 20 head with Holt's brand. Get them out of here." "And the fence?" Graham pressed. "I want your word it stays intact." "Fine. The fence stays intact." Fletcher turned and stomped into his house, slamming the door. Caroline remained on the porch, her expression unreadable as she looked at Eleanor. "You're braver than I thought coming here." "Someone has to watch my husband's back," Eleanor replied coolly. Something flickered in Caroline's eyes. Respect, maybe, or regret. "You'll need that courage. Things between our families just got worse." They waited while Fletcher's hands grudgingly rounded up Graham's cattle. It took over an hour, during which the tension remained thick enough to cut. But eventually, 20 head bearing Graham's brand were separated out and turned over. On the ride back to their ranch, driving the recovered cattle ahead of them, Graham was silent. Eleanor could see the anger still simmering in him, the worry about what this confrontation might mean for the future. "You handled that well," she said quietly. "Did I?" "Almost pulled my gun on a neighbor." Graham's voice was tight. "But you didn't. You stayed in control, got your cattle back, and avoided bloodshed." Eleanor moved Copper closer to Thunder. "And you proved you won't be pushed around. That matters out here, doesn't it?" "It does," Uncle Samuel confirmed, riding up beside them. "Fletcher will think twice before trying something like that again. You stood your ground without backing down or making it worse. Your father would have been proud." That night, after the cattle were secured in their own pasture and the fence damage assessed and repaired, Graham sat on the porch in the darkness, Eleanor beside him. "This is what I was afraid of," he said. "That you'd marry me and then discover that frontier life isn't just beautiful sunsets and growing gardens. It's disputes with neighbors, threats of violence, constant worry about losing everything you've built." "I know that," Eleanor said. "I've always known it would be hard. But hard doesn't mean wrong, Graham. Today when you confronted Fletcher, I wasn't scared. Well, I was, but I wasn't doubting my choice to be here. If anything, I was proud. Proud to be your wife. Proud that you stood up for what was right." Graham turned to her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light from the house. "You really mean that?" "I really do." She took his hand. "We're partners, remember? That means the hard times too. I'm not going anywhere." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I love you, Eleanor Holt. more than I thought I could love anyone." "I love you too," she whispered back, "through fence-cutting neighbors and cattle disputes and whatever else this life throws at us." And sitting there in the darkness, with the mountains looming above and the sounds of their ranch settling around them, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be home. The confrontation with John Fletcher cast a shadow over the ranch for the next few weeks, but life had a way of demanding attention regardless of worries. August brought the height of summer, long, hot days when the work seemed endless and the sun beat down mercilessly. Eleanor learned to tie her hair back with a kerchief, to wear Graham's old shirts for working outside, to push through exhaustion because the cattle still needed tending and the garden still needed watering. She also learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. One afternoon, Graham was out checking the northern fence line when Eleanor heard frantic bleating from near the barn. She ran to investigate and found one of their ewes. They kept a small flock of sheep for wool, caught in a tangle of old wire, blood streaming from a gash on her leg. Eleanor's first instinct was panic. Then she remembered Dr. Webb's lessons, took a breath, and assessed the situation. The wire needed cutting, the wound needed cleaning and stitching, and the sheep needed to be kept calm. She could do this. 20 minutes later, when Graham returned, he found Eleanor in the barn, the ewe lying quietly beside her with a neatly stitched wound, Eleanor's hands shaking now that the crisis was over. "What happened?" Graham asked, taking in the scene. Eleanor explained, her voice only wobbling slightly. "I remembered what Dr. Webb taught me about suturing. I hope I did it right." Graham knelt beside the ewe, examining Eleanor's work. "You did it perfectly, better than I could have done." He looked up at her, his expression full of pride and something deeper. "Eleanor, do you have any idea how remarkable you are?" "I was terrified the whole time," she admitted, "but you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Being scared and doing what needs doing regardless." He stood, pulling her into his arms. "My mother would have loved you. She always said the measure of a person wasn't whether they felt fear, but what they did in spite of it." The incident seemed to mark a turning point. The other ranchers' wives, hearing the story from Dr. Webb when he came to check on the ewe, began treating Eleanor differently, less like a newcomer to be gently handled and more like one of their own. Martha Garrett started asking her advice about preserving vegetables. Mrs. McLeod invited her to a quilting circle. Even Ada Chen nodded approvingly when Eleanor came to town. "You're putting down roots," Ada said cryptically. "Good. Land needs roots to hold it together." As August faded into September, the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn. The aspen trees on the mountainsides turned gold, and the evening shadows lengthened. Graham began preparing for winter in earnest, cutting firewood, checking the condition of the barns, making sure they had adequate supplies stored. "First winter's always hard," he told Eleanor one evening as they stacked wood. "Not just because of the weather, but because you don't know what to expect. But we'll get through it together." Eleanor was about to respond when she heard horses approaching fast. They both turned to see Uncle Samuel riding in at a gallop, his face urgent. "Graham, Fletcher's hands just drove 50 head of cattle onto your southern pasture. They're claiming it's open range, but we both know that's your deeded land." Graham's expression went hard. "He's not going to stop. First the fence cutting, now this. He's trying to push me out, take my land piece by piece." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, fear and anger warring in her chest. "We push back." Graham strode toward the house. "Samuel, round up Tom and Pete. Eleanor, can you ride to town, get the sheriff, tell him what's happening?" "The sheriff's in Denver for the week," Samuel said. "Won't be back until Monday." Graham cursed. "Then we handle this ourselves. But I want witnesses, respectable witnesses who'll testify if this goes to court." He looked at Eleanor. "Can you get Reverend Davis and Dr. Webb? Maybe Samuel Garrett, too?" "I'll get them," Eleanor said, already moving toward the barn to saddle Copper. "Be careful," Graham called after her. She rode hard into Willow Ridge, her heart pounding. At the church, she found Reverend Davis preparing for Sunday's sermon. She explained the situation quickly, and his expression grew troubled. "This is escalating dangerously," he said. "But you're right to want witnesses. I'll come. Let me fetch Dr. Webb. His house is closer." Within an hour, Eleanor was riding back to the ranch with Reverend Davis, Dr. Webb, and Samuel Garrett. They arrived to find Graham, Uncle Samuel, Tom, and Pete on horseback, facing off against Fletcher's men on the southern pasture. Fletcher himself was there, looking smug. "Reverend," Fletcher said with false friendliness. "Doctor, Garrett, didn't expect to see you folks out here." "We're here as witnesses," Reverend Davis said calmly, "to observe whatever transpires and provide testimony if needed." Fletcher's expression soured. "Nothing to witness. This is open range. My cattle have as much right here as Holt's." "This is deeded land," Graham said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You know it, I know it, and everyone here knows it. You can play these games, Fletcher, but it ends now. Get your cattle off my property, or I swear to God I'll drive them off myself." "You threatening me, boy?" Fletcher's hand moved toward his rifle. "I'm stating facts." Graham's voice was cold as winter. "You've been trying to intimidate me since my father died. Thought maybe a young man alone couldn't hold his land. But I'm not alone anymore, and I'm not backing down." Eleanor moved Copper forward, drawing surprised looks from both sides. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "you should know that my husband has documented every incident. The fence cutting, the cattle theft, and now this. We've prepared a full report for the territorial court. Dr. Webb has agreed to provide medical testimony about the suspicious accidents several of our animals have suffered. Reverend Davis has written statements from townspeople about your threatening behavior." She was improvising, but Fletcher didn't need to know that. "You can continue this harassment, but it will cost you. Legal fees, possibly criminal charges, and certainly your reputation." It was a bluff mostly, but Eleanor delivered it with such conviction that Fletcher hesitated. Caroline, who'd been sitting her horse silently behind her father, spoke up. "She's right, Daddy. This has gone too far. Everyone knows it. You're making us look like bullies." "Shut up, Caroline," Fletcher snapped. "No." Caroline's voice was firm. "I won't. This feud is stupid. Graham never did anything to us except exist and refuse to marry me. That's not a crime. And trying to steal his land because of wounded pride is just pathetic." Fletcher's face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful—" "Enough!" Reverend Davis's voice cracked like a whip. "John Fletcher, I've known you 30 years. You're a hard man, but not, I thought, a dishonest one. Yet here you are, trying to take land that doesn't belong to you, threatening violence against a neighbor. What would your father think? He and Thomas Holt were friends." Something in Fletcher's expression cracked. For a moment he looked old and tired rather than angry. "My father's dead. So's Thomas. Times change." "They do," Dr. Webb agreed quietly. "But some things shouldn't, like basic decency between neighbors. John, you've got more land than you can properly manage, more cattle than you can count. Why do you need Graham's land too?" Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he deflated. "It's not about the land," he said, so quietly they almost couldn't hear. "It's about—" Caroline's right. "It's about pride. Thomas's boy built something good after losing his parents, found himself a capable wife, has a future. And what do I have? A daughter who won't marry, sons who ran off to California, a wife who barely speaks to me. I look at Graham and see what I lost." The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Eleanor felt a flicker of unwanted sympathy, though she pushed it aside. Regret didn't excuse his actions. Graham, however, seemed to understand something Eleanor didn't. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, his voice losing its edge, "my father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he does with what he's given. You've still got time to do better. Be better." Fletcher looked at him, something complicated passing across his weathered face. Then he nodded slowly. "Get my cattle off Holt's land," he ordered his men, "and fix that fence we cut. Do it right this time." "Yes, sir," his foreman said, clearly relieved. Fletcher turned his horse without another word, riding away. Caroline lingered a moment longer. "Thank you," she said to Graham, for giving him a way out that didn't destroy his pride completely. "We're neighbors," Graham said simply. "We'll be neighbors long after this trouble is forgotten. Better to find peace now." Caroline nodded, then looked at Eleanor. "I was wrong about you. You're not weak and you're not running. I'm sorry for trying to make you doubt yourself." Eleanor inclined her head, accepting the apology without quite forgiving yet. Thank you. After the Fletchers and their men left, driving their cattle before them, the tension drained from the scene. Reverend Davis clapped Graham on the shoulder. Well handled, son. You chose peace without choosing weakness. That takes wisdom. I learned from the best, Graham said, glancing at Eleanor. Over the following weeks, life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm, calmer, more secure. Fletcher kept his word about leaving them alone, even nodding civilly when they passed on the road. The fence repairs were done properly, and when an early snowstorm caught several of Graham's cattle on Fletcher land, Fletcher's men drove them back without being asked. Might not ever be friends, Uncle Samuel observed, but at least the war's over. As autumn deepened, Eleanor threw herself into preparing for winter. She helped Graham slaughter and butcher a pig, learned to cure bacon and render lard, put up jars of vegetables and preserves until the storage room looked like a colorful treasure cave. She dried herbs from the garden, made candles, sewed heavier curtains for the windows. Every task was new, often difficult, but deeply satisfying. One October afternoon, working in the garden harvesting the last of the potatoes, Eleanor suddenly stopped, overcome by a wave of dizziness. She sat back on her heels, waiting for it to pass. Over the past week, she'd been feeling odd, tired in the mornings, occasionally queasy, emotional in ways that seemed out of proportion to events. When the dizziness passed, she continued working, but a suspicion was forming in her mind. That evening, after dinner, she approached Dr. Webb during his regular visit to check on various townspeople. "Could I speak with you privately?" she asked. In the spare bedroom, away from Graham's hearing, she described her symptoms. Dr. Webb listened, asked a few pointed questions, then smiled. "Mrs. Holt, unless I'm very much mistaken, you're expecting a baby. Probably about 2 months along." Eleanor's breath caught. "A baby?" Yes, the tiredness, the dizziness, the nausea, all typical early pregnancy symptoms. "You should see me regularly now, and we'll need to prepare properly. Winter babies can be challenging, but we've got time." After Dr. Webb left, Eleanor stood in the bedroom, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, her mind reeling. A baby. She was going to be a mother. Graham was going to be a father. They were going to be a family. She found Graham in the barn, checking on the horses for the night. He looked up when she entered, immediately sensing something different. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She crossed to him, taking his hands. "Graham, I have something to tell you." His expression shifted to concern. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. Dr. Webb just confirmed it." For a moment, Graham just stared at her. Then his face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen. He let out a whoop that startled the horses, swept Eleanor off her feet, and spun her around. "A baby! We're having a baby!" He set her down carefully, suddenly worried. "Should I have done that? Did I hurt you? What do you need? Should you be working? Should you—" Eleanor laughed, pressing her fingers to his lips. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass. Dr. Webb says I can continue normal activities for months yet. But yes, we're having a baby. In late April or early May, he thinks." Graham pulled her close, his hand splaying protectively across her stomach. "A spring baby. Mother always said spring babies were lucky." His voice was thick with emotion. "Eleanor, I never dared hope. After losing my parents, being alone so long, and now this. You've given me everything." "We've given each other everything," Eleanor corrected, her own eyes wet. They stood there in the barn, wrapped in each other's arms, the horses nickering softly around them, and Eleanor felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. All those months ago, stepping off that stagecoach had felt like the hardest thing she'd ever done. Now she understood it had been the best thing. Winter came hard and early that year. By November, snow blanketed the valley, and temperatures dropped below zero. The ranch work became a brutal routine of breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring animals had adequate shelter, and keeping the house fires burning constantly. Eleanor, her pregnancy not yet showing, but her energy levels fluctuating wildly, pushed through with determination that impressed even Graham. "You should rest more," he'd say, finding her mucking out stalls or hauling water. "I'm fine," she'd insist. "The work needs doing." Christmas brought a brief respite. The whole town gathered at the church for a special service. followed by a communal dinner at the hotel. Eleanor, now 4 months along and starting to show, received endless advice from the other mothers. "Keep your feet up when you can," Mrs. McLeod advised. "Drink raspberry leaf tea in the last month," Martha Garrett recommended. "Don't let him coddle you too much," Ada Chen said with a pointed look at Graham. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. You're not doing anything special." But Graham couldn't help coddling. He took over the heavier chores, insisted Eleanor nap in the afternoons, and worried constantly about her health. Eleanor found it both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I'm not an invalid," she reminded him one snowy January evening. "I know, I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't." The fear in his voice was raw. She understood then. He'd lost his mother, watched her die despite everyone's efforts. He'd lost his father to grief and recklessness. The thought of losing her, of losing this baby, must terrify him. "You won't lose me," she said firmly, taking his face in her hands. "I'm strong, the baby's strong, and Dr. Webb is experienced. We're going to be fine." January and February crawled past in a blur of snowstorms and cold so intense it made breathing painful. The ranch felt isolated, cut off from town by impassable roads. But instead of feeling trapped, Eleanor found a strange peace in the enforced solitude. She and Graham spent long evenings by the fire, talking, planning, dreaming about their future and their child. "Boy or girl?" Graham would ask, his hand resting on her growing belly. "I don't care, as long as they're healthy," Eleanor always replied. "If it's a girl, can we name her Sarah, after my mother? And if it's a boy?" Graham considered. "Maybe Thomas, after my father, or—" He paused. "What was your father's name?" "Robert." Eleanor's voice was soft. "He wasn't a good man in many ways, but he was still my father. I'd like our child to have something of my family, too." "Thomas Robert Holt if it's a boy, then," Graham decided, "and Sarah Eleanor Holt if it's a girl." March brought the first hints of spring, longer days, milder temperatures, the sound of water running as snow began to melt. Eleanor's pregnancy was obvious now, her belly round and her movements increasingly awkward. Dr. Webb came to the ranch as often as weather permitted, checking on her progress, preparing them both for what to expect. "Everything looks good," he said during an early April visit. "Baby's positioned correctly. Your health is excellent. I'd estimate another 3 or 4 weeks." Eleanor felt ready and terrified in equal measure. She'd been reading every book she could find on childbirth and infant care, but theoretical knowledge seemed inadequate for the reality she was facing. The night Eleanor went into labor, a late April storm was raging outside. Not snow, but rain, turning the roads to mud and the valley into a sea of water. She woke around midnight with the first contractions, knowing immediately what was happening. "Graham," she said, shaking him awake. "It's time." He bolted upright, instantly alert and terrified. "Now? But the roads, Dr. Webb can't get here in this weather." "Then we do it ourselves," Eleanor said with more calm than she felt. "You've delivered calves and foals. It's not that different." "It's completely different. You're not a cow." Graham was already pulling on clothes, his hands shaking. "Graham." Eleanor caught his arm, waiting until he looked at her. "Breathe. We can do this. Ada Chen is only a mile away. She's delivered dozens of babies. Send someone for her. She can get through." Graham nodded, his panic settling into focus. He rode out into the storm himself, returning an hour later with Ada, both of them soaked but determined. "All right, girl," Ada said briskly, taking charge. "Let's see what we're working with. Graham, I need hot water, clean linens, and then I need you out of the way. This is women's work." But Eleanor grabbed Graham's hand. "No, I want him here. I need him here." Ada looked between them, then shrugged. "Your choice. But if he faints, he's on his own." The labor lasted through the night and into the following afternoon. Eleanor had never experienced such pain, such exhaustion, such primal determination. Graham held her hand through all of it, whispering encouragement, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, never leaving her side even when Ada shooed him away. Finally, as the storm outside began to clear and late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, Eleanor felt the overwhelming urge to push. Ada positioned herself, Graham supported Eleanor from behind, and with a final tremendous effort, she felt the baby slip free. For a moment there was silence. Then a sharp, indignant wail filled the room. "A girl!" Ada announced, lifting the squalling, red-faced infant. "A healthy baby girl!" Eleanor collapsed back against Graham, tears streaming down her face as Ada quickly cleaned the baby and placed her on Eleanor's chest. The tiny creature, impossibly small, impossibly perfect, stopped crying the moment she felt her mother's skin, her dark eyes blinking up at them. "Hello, Sarah," Eleanor whispered. "Hello, little one." Graham was crying openly, his arms around both Eleanor and the baby, his face buried in Eleanor's hair. "You did it. You're both perfect. You're both here." Ada cleaned up efficiently, then stood, looking down at the new family with satisfaction. "Good work, all of you. I'll check back tomorrow, but everything looks fine. Now, Graham Holt, your wife needs rest, your daughter needs to nurse, and you need to not hover. Make yourself useful. There's a mess to clean." After Ada left, after Eleanor had nursed the baby for the first time with Ada's guidance, after everything had settled, Graham sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter with such tenderness it made Eleanor's heart ache. "She's beautiful," he said in wonder. "She looks like you." "She has your nose," Eleanor observed, exhausted but happy. "Poor thing." Graham's finger traced the baby's tiny hand, and Sarah's fingers closed around his reflexively. "Sarah Eleanor Holt, welcome to the family, little one. Welcome home." Over the next weeks, life took on a new rhythm shaped around the baby's needs. Eleanor learned to nurse, to soothe, to interpret different cries. Graham proved surprisingly adept at diaper changes and midnight rocking. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, and happier than either had thought possible. When Eleanor felt strong enough, they took Sarah to town to show her off. The entire community turned out, cooing over the baby, offering gifts and advice. Mrs. Holloway cried, holding Sarah gently. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she told Graham. Even the Fletchers made an appearance, somewhat awkwardly. John Fletcher nodded stiffly to Graham, while Caroline held the baby for a moment with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Wistfulness, perhaps, or regret for paths not taken. "She's beautiful," Caroline said simply, handing Sarah back. "You're very lucky." "We are," Eleanor agreed. As spring turned to summer, Sarah grew and thrived. Eleanor watched her husband transform into a father, patient, loving, utterly devoted. She watched her daughter discover the world, fascinated by sunlight, delighted by the dogs, content to be carried in a sling while Eleanor worked in the garden. One evening in July, exactly a year after Eleanor had arrived in Willow Ridge, she and Graham sat on the porch as they had so many times before. Sarah was asleep in her cradle beside them, and the valley stretched before them in the golden light of sunset. "Do you ever think about that day?" Graham asked, "when you got off the stagecoach?" "All the time," Eleanor admitted. "I was so scared. Everything seemed impossible." "I thought maybe you'd take one look at me and get right back on that coach." Eleanor laughed. "I nearly did. If you hadn't held out your hand, if you hadn't promised I wouldn't have to take that step alone, I might have." Graham reached over, taking her hand in his, just as he had that day. "I'm glad you took the step. Every day I'm glad." "So am I." Eleanor looked at their daughter, at the ranch spread before them, at the mountains standing eternal against the sky. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, desperate, frightened, running from a life that had collapsed around her. She thought about the woman she was now, capable, confident, deeply rooted in this place and this life she'd chosen. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "What?" "I'm not that scared girl on the stagecoach anymore. I'm not someone who needs saving or who's running away. I'm home. I'm exactly where I belong." Graham pulled her close, his other hand reaching to rock Sarah's cradle gently. "We both are. This is where we belong, all three of us." Years later, when Sarah was old enough to understand, Eleanor would tell her the story of how she almost didn't step down from that stagecoach, how a patient cowboy had held out his hand and changed everything. She'd tell her about the journey from Boston, about learning to be a rancher's wife, about facing down bullies and delivering lambs and finding courage she didn't know she possessed. But tonight, in the peaceful summer evening with her husband beside her and her daughter sleeping safely, Eleanor simply sat in contentment. The first step had been the hardest, just as Graham had said, but every step since had brought her closer to this moment, this place, this life that was more than she'd ever dreamed of asking for. The mail-order bride who'd been too afraid to step down had found her courage, found her home, and found love that would last a lifetime. And that, Eleanor thought, as the stars began to emerge above the mountains, was more than enough. It was everything.